Chapter 5. Asymmetrical synthesis of the sensible. Difference is not diversity. Diversity is given, but difference is that by which the given is given, that by which the given is given as diverse. Difference is not phenomenon but the noumen and closest to the phenomenon. It is therefore true that God makes the world by calculating, but his calculations never work out exactly just, and this inexactitude or injustice in the result, this irreducible inequality, forms the condition of the world. The world happens while God calculates. If the calculation were exact, there would be no world. The world can be regarded as a remainder, and the real in the world understood in terms of fractional or even incommensurable numbers. Every phenomenon refers to an inequality by which it is conditioned. Every diversity and every change refers to a difference which is its sufficient reason. Everything which happens and everything which appears is correlated with orders of differences, differences of level, temperature, pressure, tension, potential, difference of intensity. Carnot's principle says this in one fashion, Curie's principle in another. There are locks everywhere. Every phenomenon flashes in a signal sign system. Insofar as a system is constituted or bounded by at least two heterogeneous series, two disparate orders capable of entering into communication, we call it a signal. The phenomenon that flashes across this system, bringing about the communication between disparate series, is a sign. The emerald hides in its facets a bright-eyed water sprite. Every phenomenon is of the bright-eyed water sprite type, made possible by an emerald. Every phenomenon is composite because not only are the two series which bound it heterogeneous but each is itself composed of heterogeneous terms, subtended by heterogeneous series which form so many subphenomena. The expression difference of intensity is a tautology. Intensity is the form of difference insofar as this is the reason of the sensible. Every intensity is differential. By itself a difference. Every intensity is E, where E itself refers to an E, and E to E, etc. Each intensity is already a coupling, in which each element of the couple refers in turn to couples of elements of another order, thereby revealing the properly qualitative content of quantity. We call this state of infinitely doubled difference which resonates to infinity disparity. Disparity, in other words, difference or intensity, difference of intensity, is the sufficient reason of all phenomena, the condition of that which appears. Novlis, with his tourmalin, is closer to the conditions of the sensible than Kant, with space and time. The reason of the sensible, the condition of that which appears, is not space and time but the unequal in itself, disparateness as it is determined and comprised in difference of intensity, in intensity as difference. Nevertheless, we encounter severe difficulties when we attempt to consider Carnot's or Curie's principles as local manifestations of a transcendental principle. We know only forms of energy which are already localized and distributed in extensity, or extensities already qualified by forms of energy. Energetics defined a particular energy by the combination of two factors, one intensive and one extensive, for example, force and distance for linear energy, surface tension and surface area for surface energy, pressure and volume for volume energy, height and weight for gravitational energy, temperature and entropy for thermal energy. It turns out that, in experience, intensio, intention, is inseparable from an extensio, extension, which relatcessit to the extensum, extensity. In these conditions, intensity itself is subordinated to the qualities which fill extensity, primary physical qualities or qualitas, and secondary perceptible qualities or quale. In short, we know intensity only as already developed within an extensity, and as covered over by qualities. Whence our tendency to consider intensive quantity as a badly grounded empirical concept, an impure mixture of a sensible quality and extensity, or even of a physical quality and an extensive quantity. It is true that this tendency would lead nowhere if intensity, for its own part, did not present a corresponding tendency within the extensity in which it develops and under the quality which covers it. Intensity is difference, but this difference tends to deny or to cancel itself out in extensity and underneath quality. It is true that qualities are signs which flash across the interval of a difference. In so doing, however, they measure the time of an equalization, in other words, the time taken by the difference to cancel itself out in the extensity in which it is distributed. This is the most general content of the principles of Carnot, Curie, Le Chatelier, et al. Difference is the sufficient reason of change only to the extent that the change tends to negate difference. It is indeed in this manner that the principle of causality finds, in the signaling process, its categorical physical determination. Intensity defines an objective sense for a series of irreversible states which pass, like an arrow of time, from more to less differentiated, from a productive to a reduced difference, and ultimately to a cancelled difference. We know how these themes of a reduction of difference, a uniformization of diversity, and an equalization of inequality stitched together for the last time a strange alliance at the end of the 19th century between science, good sense and philosophy. Thermodynamics was the powerful furnace of that alloy. A system of basic definitions was established which satisfied everybody, including a certain Kantianism. The given as diverse, reason as a process of identification and equalization tending towards identity, the absurd or irrational as the resistance of the diverse to that identificatory reason. The words the real is rational found there a new sense, for diversity tended to be reduced in nature no less than in reason. As a result, difference was neither a law of nature nor a category of the mind but only the origin equals x of the diverse, a given, but not a value, except a regulative or compensatory value. In truth, our epistemological tendency to be suspicious of the notion of intensive quantity would prove nothing were it not linked to this other tendency on the part of differences of intensity to cancel themselves out in qualified extended systems. Intensity is suspect only because it seems to rush headlong into suicide. Science and philosophy here gave a final satisfaction to good sense. For it is not science that is in question, it remains indifferent to the extension of Carnot's principle, nor philosophy, which also, after a fashion, remains indifferent to Carnot's principle. Every time science, philosophy and good sense come together it is inevitable that good sense should take itself for a science and a philosophy, that is why such encounters must be avoided at all costs. It is therefore a question of the essence of good sense. This essence is clearly and concisely outlined by Hegel in the difference between the systems of Fichte and Schelling. Good sense is partial truth insofar as this is joined to the feeling of the absolute. The truth in the form of reason is present in a partial state, and the absolute is there in the form of a feeling. But how is the feeling of the absolute attached to the partial truth? Good sense essentially distributes or repartitions, on the one hand and on the other hand are the characteristic formulae of its false profundity or platitude. It distributes things. It is obvious, however, that not every distribution flows from good sense. There are distributions inspired by madness, mad repartitions. Perhaps good sense even presupposes madness in order to come after and correct what madness there is in any prior distribution. A distribution is in conformity with good sense when it tends to banish difference from the distributed. Only when the inequality of the portions is supposed to disappear from the milieu over time does the repartition effectively conform to good sense, or follow a sense which is called good. Good sense is by nature eschatological, the prophet of a final compensation and homogenization. If it comes second, this is because it presupposes mad distribution, instantaneous, nomadic distribution, crowned anarchy or difference. However, this sedentary, patient figure which has time on its side corrects difference, introduces it into a milieu which leads to the cancellation of differences or the compensation of portions. It is itself this milieu. Thinking itself to be in between the extremes, it holds them off and fills in the interval. It does not negate differences, on the contrary, it arranges things in the order of time and under the conditions of extensity such that they negate themselves. It multiplies the intermediates and, like Plato's demiurge, ceaselessly and patiently transforms the unequal into the divisible. Good sense is the ideology of the middle classes who recognize themselves in equality as an abstract product. It dreams less of acting than of constituting a natural milieu, the element of an action which passes from more to less differentiated. For example, the good sense of 18th century political economy which saw in the commercial classes the natural compensation for the extremes, and in the prosperity of commerce the mechanical process of the equalization of portions. It therefore dreams less of acting than of foreseeing, and of allowing free rein to action which goes from the unpredictable to the predictable, from the production of differences to their reduction. Neither contemplative nor active, it is prescient. In short, it goes from the side of things to the side of fire, from differences produced to differences reduced. It is thermodynamic. In this sense it attaches the feeling of the absolute to the partial truth. It is neither optimistic nor pessimistic, but assumes a pessimistic or optimistic tint depending upon whether the side of fire, which consumes everything and renders all portions uniform, bears the sign of an inevitable death and nothingness. We are all equal before death. Or, on the contrary, bears the happy plenitude of existence. We all have an equal chance in life. Good sense does not negate difference, on the contrary, it recognizes difference just enough to affirm that it negates itself, given sufficient extensity and time. Between mad difference and difference cancelled, between the unequal in the divisible and the divisible equalized, between the distribution of the unequal and equality distributed, Good sense necessarily lives itself as a universal rule of distribution, and therefore as universally distributed. Good sense is based upon a synthesis of time, in particular the one which we have determined as the first synthesis, that of habit. Good sense is good only because it is wedded to the sense of time associated with that synthesis. Testifying to a living present, and to the fatigue of that present, it goes from past to future as though from particular to general. However, it defines this past as the improbable or the less probable. In effect, since every partial system has its origin in a difference which individualizes its domain, how would an observer situated within the system grasp this difference except as past and highly improbable, given that it is behind him? On the other hand, at the heart of the same system, the future, the probable and the cancellation of difference are identified in the direction indicated by the arrow of time, in other words, the right direction. This condition grounds prediction itself. It has often been noticed that if initially indistinguishable temperatures are allowed to differentiate, it cannot be predicted which will increase or decrease, and if viscosity is accelerated, it will tear moving bodies from their state of rest, but in an unpredictable direction. Well-known pages by Boltzmann comment upon this scientific and thermodynamic guarantee of good sense. They show how within a partial system difference, the improbable and the past are identified on the one hand, while uniformity, the probable and the future are identified on the other. In the dream of a truly universal good sense, one which attaches the feeling of the absolute to partial truths, along with the moon to the earth, this equalization and homogenization do not occur only in each partial system, but continue from one system to another. However, as Boltzmann shows, this attachment is not legitimate, any more than this synthesis of time is sufficient. We are at least in a position to clarify the relation between good sense and common sense. Common sense was defined subjectively by the supposed identity of a self which provided the unity and ground of all the faculties, and objectively by the identity of whatever object served as a focus for all the faculties. This double identity, however, remains static. We no more find ourselves before a universal indeterminate object than we are a universal self. Objects are divided up in and by fields of individuation, as ourselves. Common sense must therefore point beyond itself towards another dynamic instance, capable of determining the indeterminate object as this or that, and of individualizing the self situated in this ensemble of objects. This other instance is good sense, which takes its point of departure from a difference at the origin of individuation. However, precisely because it ensures the distribution of that difference in such a manner that it tends to be cancelled in the object, and because it provides a rule according to which the different objects tend to equalize themselves and the different selves tend to become uniform, good sense in turn points towards the instance of a common sense which provides it with both the form of a universal self and that of an indeterminate object. Good sense, therefore, has two definitions, one objective and one subjective, which correspond to those of common sense, a rule of universal distribution and a rule universally distributed. Good sense and common sense each refer to the other, each reflect the other and constitute one half of the orthodoxy. In view of this reciprocity and double reflection, we can define common sense by the process of recognition and good sense by the process of prediction. The one involves the qualitative synthesis of diversity, the static synthesis of qualitative diversity related to an object supposed the same for all the faculties of a single subject, the other involves the quantitative synthesis of difference, the dynamic synthesis of difference in quantity related to a system in which it is objectively and subjectively cancelled. Nevertheless, difference remains not the given itself but that by which the given is given. How could thought avoid going that far? How could it avoid thinking that which is most opposed to thought? With the identical, we think with all our force, but without producing the least thought. With the different, by contrast, do we not have the highest thought, but also that which cannot be thought? This protestation of the different is full of sense. Even if difference tends to be distributed throughout diversity in such a manner as to disappear, and to render uniform the diversity it creates, it must first be sensed as that which gives diversity to be sensed. Moreover, it must be thought as that which creates diversity. Not because we would then return to the common exercise of the faculties, but precisely because the dissociated faculties enter into the violent relation in which each transmits its constraint to the other. Delirium lies at the base of good sense, which is why good sense is always secondary. Thought must think difference, that absolutely different from thought which nevertheless gives it thought, gives to be thought. In some fine pages, Lalande says that reality is difference, whereas the law of reality, or principle of thought, is identification. Reality is therefore in opposition to the law of reality, the present state with what it will become. How could such a state of affairs come to be? How could it be that the physical world is constituted by a fundamental property which its own laws endlessly attenuate? 6. In other words, reality is not the result of the laws which govern it, and a saturnine God devours at one end what he has made at the other, legislating against his creation because he has created against his legislation. Thus we are forced to sense and to think difference. We sense something which is contrary to the laws of nature, we think something which is contrary to the principles of thought. Moreover, even if the production of difference is by definition inexplicable, how can we avoid implicating the inexplicable at the heart of thought itself? How can the unthinkable not lie at the heart of thought? Or delirium at the heart of good sense? How can we be content to relegate the improbable to the beginning of a partial evolution, without also grasping it as the highest power of the past, or as the immemorial in memory? In this sense the partial synthesis of the present already led us into another synthesis of time, that of the immemorial memory, at the risk of leading us further still. Philosophy is revealed not by good sense but by paradox. Paradox is the pathos or the passion of philosophy. There are several kinds of paradox, all of which are opposed to the complementary forms of orthodoxy, namely, good sense and common sense. Subjectively, paradox breaks up the common exercise of the faculties and places each before its own limit, before its incomparable, thought before the unthinkable which it alone is nevertheless capable of thinking, memory before the forgotten which is also its immemorial, sensibility before the imperceptible which is indistinguishable from its intensive. At the same time, however, paradox communicates to the broken faculties that relation which is far from good sense, aligning them along a volcanic line which allows one to ignite the other, leaping from one limit to the next. Objectively, paradox displays the element which cannot be totalized within a common element, along with the difference which cannot be equalized or cancelled at the direction of a good sense. It is correct to say that the only refutation of paradoxes lies in good sense and common sense themselves, but on condition that they are already allowed everything, the role of judge as well as that of party to the case, the absolute along with the partial truth. It is not surprising that, strictly speaking, difference should be inexplicable. Difference is explicated, but in systems in which it tends to be cancelled, this means only that difference is essentially implicated, that its being is implication. For difference, to be explicated is to be cancelled or to dispel the inequality which constitutes it. The formula according to which to explicate is to identify is a tautology. We cannot conclude from this that difference is cancelled out, or at least that it is cancelled in itself. It is cancelled insofar as it is drawn outside itself, in extensity and in the quality which fills that extensity. However, difference creates both this extensity and this quality. Intensity is developed and explicated by means of an extension, extensio, which relates it to the extensity, extensum, in which it appears outside itself and hidden beneath quality. Difference of intensity is cancelled or tends to be cancelled in this system, but it creates this system by explicating itself. Whence the double aspect of the quality is a sign, it refers to an implicated order of constitutive differences, and tends to cancel out those differences in the extended order in which they are explicated. This is also why causality finds in signaling at once both an origin and an orientation or destination, where the destination in a sense denies the origin. The peculiarity of effects, in the causal sense, is to have a perceptual effect and to be able to be called by a proper name, Seebeck effect, Kelvin effect, because they emerge in a properly differential field of individuation which the name symbolizes. The vanishing of difference is precisely inseparable from an effect of which we are victims. Difference in the form of intensity remains implicated in itself, while it is cancelled by being explicated in extensity. It is therefore unnecessary, in order to save the universe from heat death or to safeguard the chances of eternal return, to imagine highly improbable extensive mechanisms supposedly capable of restoring difference. For difference has never ceased to be in itself, to be implicated in itself even while it is explicated outside itself. Therefore, not only are there sensory illusions but there is also a transcendental physical illusion. In this regard, we believe that Leon Sell made a profound discovery. In opposing Carnot and Clausius, he wanted to show that the increase of entropy was illusory. Moreover, he pointed out certain empirical or contingent factors of this illusion, the relative smallness of the differences in temperature produced in thermal machines, the enormity of the dampening which seems to preclude the construction of a thermal ram. Above all, however, he discovered a transcendental form of illusion. Of all extensions, entropy is the only one which is not measurable either directly or indirectly by any procedure independent of energetics. If it were the same for volume or for quantity of electricity, we would necessarily have the impression that these increase through irreversible transformations. The paradox of entropy is the following: entropy is an extensive factor, but, unlike all other extensive factors, it is an extension or explication which is implicated as such in intensity, which does not exist outside the implication or except as implicated, and this is because it has the function of making possible the general movement by which that which is implicated explicates itself or is extended. There is thus a transcendental illusion essentially tied to the qualitas, heat, and to the extension, entropy. It is notable that extensity does not account for the individuations which occur within it. No doubt the high and the low, the right and the left, the figure and the ground are individuating factors which trace rises and falls, currents and descents in extensity. However, since they take place within an already developed extensity, their value is only relative. They therefore flow from a deeper instance, depth itself, which is not an extension but a pure implex. No doubt every depth is also a possible length and size, but this possibility is realized only insofar as an observer changes place and gathers into an abstract concept that which is length for itself and that which is length for others. In fact, it is always on the basis of a new depth that the old one becomes length or is explicated in length. It obviously amounts to the same thing whether we consider a simple plane, or an extensity in 3 dimensions where the third is homogeneous with the other two. Once depth is grasped as an extensive quantity, it belongs to engendered extensity and ceases to include in itself its own heterogeneity in relation to the other two. We see then that it is the ultimate dimension of extensity, but we see this only as a fact without understanding the reason, since we no longer know that it is original. We also then note the presence in extensity of individuating factors, but without understanding where their power comes from, since we no longer know that they express the original depth. It is depth which explicates itself as right and left in the first dimension, as high and low in the second, and as figure and ground in the homogenized third. Extensity does not develop or appear without presenting a left and a right, a high and a low, an above and a below, which are like the dissymmetrical marks of its own origin. The relativity of these determinations, moreover, is further testimony to the absolute from which they come. Extensity as a whole comes from the depths. Depth as their ultimate and original, heterogeneous dimension is the matrix of all extensity, including its third dimension considered to be homogeneous with the other two. The ground as it appears in a homogeneous extensity is notably a projection of something deeper, profound, only the latter may be called unground or groundless. The law of figure and ground would never hold for objects distinguished from a neutral background or a background of other objects unless the object itself entertained relation to its own depth. The relation between figure and ground is only an extrinsic plane relation which presupposes an internal, voluminous relation between surfaces and the depth which they envelop. This synthesis of depth which endows the object with its shadow, but makes it emerge from that shadow, bears witness to the furthest past and to the coexistence of the past with the present. We should not be surprised that the pure spatial syntheses here repeat the temporal syntheses previously specified. THF explication of extensity rests upon the first synthesis, that of habit or the present, but the implication of depth rests upon the second synthesis, that of memory and the past. Furthermore, in depth the proximity and simmering of the third synthesis make themselves felt, announcing the universal ungrounding. Depth is like the famous geological line from Ni to SW, the line which comes diagonally from the heart of things and distributes volcanoes. It unites a bubbling sensibility and a thought which rumbles in its crater. Schelling said that depth is not added from without to length and breadth, but remains buried, like the sublime principle of the differend which creates them. Extensity can emerge from the depths only if depth is definable independently of extensity. The extensity whose genesis we are attempting to establish is extensive magnitude, the extensum or term of reference of all the extensio. The original depth, by contrast, is indeed space as a whole, but space as an intensive quantity, the pure spatium. We know that sensation or perception has an ontological aspect, precisely in the syntheses which are peculiar to it, confronted by that which can only be sensed or that which can only be perceived. Now, it appears that depth is essentially implicated in the perception of extensity. Neither depth nor distances are judged by the apparent magnitude of objects, but, on the contrary, depth envelops in itself distances which develop in extensity and explicate in turn the apparent magnitudes. It also appears that depth and distances, in this state of implication, are fundamentally linked to the intensity of the sensation. It is the power of diminution of the intensity experienced that provides a perception of depth, or rather, provides depth to perception. The perceived quality presupposes intensity, because it expresses only a resemblance to a band of isolatable intensities, within the limits of which a permanent object is constituted, the qualified object which affirms its identity across variable distances. Intensity, which envelops distances, is explicated in extensity, while extensity develops, exteriorizes and homogenizes these very distances. At the same time, a quality occupies this extensity, either in the form of a qualitas which defines the milieu of a direction, or in the form of a quale which characterizes a given object in relation to that direction. Intensity is simultaneously the imperceptible and that which can only be sensed. How could it be sensed for itself, independently of the qualities which cover it and the extensity in which it is distributed? But how could it be other than sensed, since it is what gives to be sensed, and defines the proper limits of sensibility? Depth is simultaneously the imperceptible and that which can only be perceived. In this sense, Palliard called it simultaneously both conditioning and conditioned, and showed the existence of an inverse complementary relation between distance as ideal existence and distance as visual existence. The strangest alliance is formed between intensity and depth, which carries each faculty to its own limit and allows it to communicate only at the peak of its particular solitude, an alliance between being and itself in difference. Depth and intensity are the same at the level of being, but the same in so far as this is said of difference. Depth is the intensity of being, or vice versa. Out of this intensive depth emerge at once the extensio and the extensum, the qualitas and the quae, e. The vectors or vectorial magnitudes which occur throughout extensity, but also the scalar magnitudes or particular cases of vector potentials, are the eternal witness to the intensive origin, for example, altitudes. The fact that they cannot be added in any order whatsoever, or that they have an essential relation to an order of succession, refers us back to the synthesis of time which acts in depth. Kant defined all intuitions as extensive quantities, in other words, quantities such that the representation of the parts necessarily preceded and made possible the representation of the whole. However, space and time are not presented as they are represented. On the contrary, the presentation of the whole grounds the possibility of the parts, the latter being only virtual and actualized only by the determinate values of empirical intuition. It is empirical intuition which is extensive. While he refuses a logical extension to space and time, Kant's mistake is to maintain a geometrical extension for it, and to reserve intensive quantity for the matter which fills a given extensity to some degree or other. In the case of enantiomorphic bodies, Kant recognized precisely an internal difference. However, since it was not a conceptual difference, on his view it could refer only to an external relation with extensity as a whole in the form of extensive magnitude. In fact, the paradox of symmetrical objects, like everything concerning right and left, high and low, figure and ground, has an intensive source. Space as pure intuition or spatium is an intensive quantity, and intensity as a transcendental principle is not merely the anticipation of perception but the source of a quadruple genesis, that of the extensio in the form of schema, that of extensity in the form of extensive magnitude, that of qualitas in the form of matter occupying extensity, and that of the quale in the form of designation of an object. Hermann Cohen was right, therefore, to attach full value to the principle of intensive quantities in his reinterpretation of Kantianism. While space may be irreducible to concepts, its affinity with ideas cannot nevertheless be denied, in other words, its capacity, as intensive spatium, to determine in extensity the actualization of ideal connections, as differential relations contained in the idea. Finally, while the conditions of possible experience may be related to extension, there are also subjacent conditions of real experience which are indistinguishable from intensity as such. Intensity has three characteristics. According to the first, intensive quantity includes the unequal in itself. It represents difference in quantity, that which cannot be cancelled in difference in quantity or that which is unequalizable in quantity itself. It is therefore the quality which belongs to quantity. It appears less as a species of the genus quantity than as the figure of a fundamental or original moment present in every quantity. On the other hand, this means that extensive quantity is the figure of another moment which indicates, rather, quantitative destination or finality, in a partial numerical system. In the history of number, we see that every systematic type is constructed on the basis of an essential inequality, and retains that inequality in relation to the next lowest type. Thus, fractions involve the impossibility of reducing the relation between two quantities to a whole number. Irrational numbers in turn express the impossibility of determining a common aliquot part for two quantities, and thus the impossibility of reducing their relation to even a fractional number, and so on. It is true that a given type of number does not retain an inequality in its essence without banishing or cancelling it within the new order that it installs. Thus, fractional numbers compensate for their characteristic inequality by the equality of an aliquot part. Irrational numbers subordinate their inequality to an equality of purely geometric relations or, better still, arithmetically speaking, to a limit equality indicated by a convergent series of rational numbers. Here, however, we rediscover only the duality between explication and the implicit, between extensity and the intensive, for if a type of number cancels its difference, it does so only by explicating it within the extension that it installs. Nevertheless, it maintains this difference in itself in the implicated order by which it is grounded. Every number is originally intensive and vectorial insofar as it implies a difference of quantity which cannot properly be cancelled, but extensive and scalar insofar as it cancels this difference on another plane that it creates and on which it has explicated. Even the simplest type of number confirms this duality. Natural numbers are first ordinal, in other words, originally intensive. Cardinal numbers result from these and are presented as the explication of the ordinal. It is often objected that ordination cannot lie at the origin of number because it already implies cardinal operations of colligation. This, however, is because the formula the cardinal results from the ordinal has been poorly understood. Ordination in no way presupposes the repetition of the same unit which must be cardinalized every time the following ordinal number is reached. Ordinal construction does not imply a supposed same unit but only, as we shall see, an irreducible notion of distance. The distance is implicated in the depth of an intensive spatium, ordered differences. Identical unity is not presupposed by ordination, on the contrary, this belongs to cardinal number and presupposes an extensive equality among cardinal numbers, a relative equivalence of exteriorized terms. We should not, therefore, believe that cardinal number results analytically from ordinal, or from the final terms of finite ordinal series. The preceding objection would then be justified. In fact, ordinal number becomes cardinal only by extension, to the extent that the distances enveloped in the spatium are explicated, or developed and equalized in an extensity established by natural number. We should therefore say that, from the outset, the concept of number is synthetic. Intensity is the uncancelable indifference of quantity, but this difference of quantity is cancelled by extension, extension being precisely the process by which intensive difference is turned inside out and distributed in such a way as to be dispelled, compensated, equalized and suppressed in the extensity which it creates. Nevertheless, how many necessary operations must intervene in this process? Admirable pages in the Timaeus bring together the divisible and the indivisible. The important point is that the divisible is defined as that which bears in itself the unequal, whereas the indivisible, the same or the one, seeks to impose an equality upon it, and thereby render it docile. God begins by making a mixture of the two elements. However, precisely because the divisible, B, escapes the mixture and shows its inequality and oddness, God obtains only A plus Bj2 equals C. As a result, he must make a second mixture, A plus Bj2 plus C, in other words, A plus B/2 plus, A plus Bj2. This mixture, however, also rebels, and he must avert the rebellion. He distributes it into parts according to two arithmetic progressions, one whose principle is 2, which refers to the element A, 1, 2, 4, 8, and the other whose principle is 3, which refers to C and recognizes the oddness of B, 1, 3, 9, 27. Now God is faced with intervals, with distances to fill. He does this with two intermediates, one of which is arithmetic, corresponding to A, while the other is harmonic, corresponding to C. From this may be derived the relations, and the relations between these relations, which pursue the task of tracking the unequal in the divisible throughout the entire mixture. Furthermore, God must cut the whole in two, cross over the two halves and then bend them into two circles, such that the outer circle contains the A equal in the form of the movement of the same, while the other, inner circle, orientated along a diagonal, retains what subsists of inequality in the divisible by distributing it among secondary circles. Finally, God has not defeated the unequal in itself but only separated it from the divisible and enclosed it within an outer circle, kaklosikzathen. He has equalized the divisible in this extension which is the extension of the soul of the world, but underneath, at the deepest layer of the divisible, the unequal still rumbles in intensity. This is of little consequence to God, for he fills the entire expanse of the soul with the extensity of bodies and their qualities. He covers everything. Nevertheless, he dances upon a volcano. Never have so many, so diverse and such demented operations been multiplied in order to draw from the depths of an intensive spatium a serene and docile extensity, and to dispel a difference which subsists in itself even when it is cancelled outside itself. The labor of God is always threatened by the third hypothesis of the Parmenides, that of the differential or intensive instant. A second characteristic flows from the first, since it is already difference in itself and comprises inequality as such. Intensity affirms difference. It makes difference an object of affirmation. Curie commented that it was useful but misleading to speak of dissymmetry in negative terms, as though it were the absence of symmetry, without inventing positive terms capable of designating the infinite number of operations with unmatched outcomes. The same goes for inequality. It is through inequalities that we discover the affirmative formula for irrational numbers. For p and q whole, each number, pq.f2, will always exceed a certain value. It is also through inequalities that we can positively establish the convergence of a series, rounding up to the highest integer. The important enterprise of a mathematics without negation is obviously not based upon identity, which, on the contrary, determines the negative by the excluded middle and non-contradiction. It rests axiomatically upon an affirmative definition of inequality, (t), for two natural numbers, and in other cases, upon a positive definition of distance, (t), which brings into play three terms in an infinite series of affirmative relations. In order to appreciate the logical power of an affirmation of distances in the pure element of positive difference, we need only consider the formal difference between the following two propositions: if A, T B is impossible, then A equals B. If O is distant from every number C which is distant from B, then A equals B. We shall see, however, that the distance referred to here is by no means an extensive magnitude, but must be related to its intensive origin. Since intensity is already difference, it refers to a series of other differences that it affirms by affirming itself. It is said that in general there are no reports of null frequencies, no effectively null potentials, no absolutely null pressure, as though are a line with logarithmic graduations where zero lies at the end of an infinite series of smaller and smaller fractions. We must advance further, at the risk of falling into an ethics of intensive quantities. Constructed on at least two series, one superior and one inferior, with each series referring in turn to other implicated series, intensity affirms even the lowest. It makes the lowest an object of affirmation. The power of a waterfall or a very deep descent is required to go that far and make an affirmation even of descent. Everything is like the flight of an eagle, overflight, suspension and descent. Everything goes from high to low, and by that movement affirms the lowest. Asymmetrical synthesis. High and low, moreover, are only a manner of speaking. It is a question of depth, and of the lower depth which essentially belongs to it. There is no depth which is not a seeker of a lower depth. It is there that distance develops, but distance understood as the affirmation of that which it distances, or difference as the sublimation of the lower. When does the negative emerge? Negation is the inverted image of difference, in other words, the image of intensity seen from below. In effect, everything is overturned. What, from on high, is affirmation of difference becomes from below the negation of that which differs. Here again, therefore, the negative appears only with extensity and quality. We have seen that the first dimension of extensity was a power of limitation, while the second was a power of opposition. These two figures of the negative are grounded upon the conservative character of extensions. An extension within a system cannot be increased without decreasing the extension of the same kind in a related system. Quality in turn seems inseparable from opposition, the opposition of contradiction, as Plato showed, to the extent that each quality presupposes the identity of more and less in the intensities it isolates, the opposition of contrariety in the paired distribution of qualities themselves. Moreover, when contrariety fails, as in the case of odors, this is in order to make room for a play of limitations in a series of increasing or decreasing resemblances. There is no doubt that resemblance is the law of quality, just as equality is that of extensity, or invariance that of extension. As a result, extensity and quality are the two forms of generality. However, precisely this is sufficient to make them the elements of representation, without which representation itself would not be able to fulfill its dearest task, which is to relate difference to the identical. We can therefore add a third reason to the two which we have already given in order to explain the illusion of the negative. Difference is not negation. On the contrary, the negative is difference inverted, seen from below. Always the candle in the bovine eye. Difference is inverted, first, by the requirements of representation which subordinate it to identity. Then, by the shadow of problems which give rise to the illusion of the negative. Finally, by extensity and quality which cover or explicate intensity. It is underneath quality and within extensity that intensity appears upside down, and that its characteristic difference takes the form of the negative, either of limitation or of opposition. The fate of difference is tied to the negative only within extensity and quality, which precisely tend to cancel difference. Every time we find ourselves confronted with qualified oppositions and in an extensity in which these are distributed, we must not count upon an extensive synthesis which would overcome and resolve them. On the contrary, the constituent disparities or enveloped distances inhabit intensive depth. These are the source of the illusion of the negative, but also the principle of the denunciation of this illusion. Only depth resolves, because only difference gives rise to problems. It is not the synthesis of the different which leads to reconciliation in extensity, pseudo-affirmation, but, on the contrary, the differentiation of their difference which affirms them in intensity. Oppositions are always planar, they express on a given plane only the distorted effect of an original depth. This has often been commented upon for stereoscopic images. More generally, every field of forces refers back to a potential energy, every opposition refers to a deeper disparateness, and oppositions are resolved in time and extensity only to the extent that the disparates have first invented their order of communication in depth and rediscovered that dimension in which they envelop one another, tracing hardly recognizable intensive paths through the ulterior world of qualified extensity. What is the being of the sensible? Given the conditions of this question, the answer must designate the paradoxical existence of a something which simultaneously cannot be sensed, from the point of view of the empirical exercise, and can only be sensed, from the point of view of the transcendent exercise. In a passage from Book 7 of the Republic, Plato showed how such a being transmits a shock to the other faculties, shaking them from their torpor, stirring the memory and constraining thought. However, Plato characterizes this being as the contrary sensible, that which gives rise to contrary sensations at the same time. As the Philebus expressly shows, Plato means that sensible qualities or relations are not in themselves separable from a contrariety, or even a contradiction, in the subject to which they are attributed. Since every quality is a becoming, one does not become harder, or taller, than one was without at the same time becoming softer, or smaller, than one is in the process of becoming. We cannot avoid this by distinguishing times, since the distinction between times is subsequent to the becoming which interposes the one in the other and, at the same time, posits both the movement by which the new present is constituted and the movement by which the former present is constituted as past. It seems impossible to escape a mad becoming or an unlimited becoming which implies the identity of opposites in the form of the coexistence of more and less with a given quality. However, this Platonic response will not do. In fact, it rests upon intensive quantities, but recognizes these only in qualities in the course of development, and for this reason, it assigns both the being of the sensible and contrariety to qualities. However, while the contrary sensible or contrariety in the quality may constitute sensible being par excellence, they by no means constitute the being of the sensible. It is difference in intensity, not contrariety in quality, which constitutes the being of the sensible. Qualitative contrariety is only the reflection of the intense, a reflection which betrays it by explicating it in extensity. It is intensity or difference in intensity which constitutes the peculiar limit of sensibility. As such, it has the paradoxical character of that limit. It is the imperceptible, that which cannot be sensed because it is always covered by a quality which alienates or contradicts it, always distributed within an extensity which inverts and cancels it. In another sense, it is that which can only be sensed or that which defines the transcendent exercise of sensibility, because it gives to be sensed, thereby awakening memory and forcing thought. The point of sensory distortion is often to grasp intensity independently of extensity or prior to the qualities in which it is developed. A pedagogy of the senses, which forms an integral part of transcendentalism, is directed towards this aim. Pharmacodynamic experiences or physical experiences such as vertigo approach the same result. They reveal to us that difference in itself, that depth in itself, or that intensity in itself at the original moment at which it is neither qualified nor extended. At this point, the harrowing character of intensity, however weak, restores its true meaning, not the anticipation of perception but the proper limit of sensibility from the point of view of a transcendent exercise. In terms of a third characteristic which includes the other two, intensity is an implicated, enveloped or embryonized quantity. Not implicated in quality, for it is only secondarily so. Intensity is primarily implicated in itself, implicating and implicated. We must conceive of implication as a perfectly determined form of being. Within intensity, we call that which is really implicated and enveloping difference, and we call that which is really implicated or enveloped distance. For this reason, intensity is neither divisible, like extensive quantity, nor indivisible, like quality. The divisibility of extensive quantities is defined in the following manner: by the relative determination of a unit, this unit itself never being indivisible but only marking the level at which division ceases; by the equivalence of the parts determined by the unit; by the consubstantiality of the parts with the whole which is divided. Division can therefore take place and be continued without any change in the nature of what is being divided. By contrast, when it is pointed out that a temperature is not composed of other temperatures, or a speed of other speeds, what is meant is that each temperature is already a difference, and that differences are not composed of differences of the same order but imply series of heterogeneous terms. As Rosny showed, the fiction of a homogeneous quantity vanishes with intensity. An intensive quantity may be divided, but not without changing its nature. In a sense, it is therefore indivisible, but only because no part exists prior to the division and no part retains the same nature after division. We should nevertheless speak of smaller and greater, according to whether the nature of a given part presupposes a given change of nature or is presupposed by it. Thus, the acceleration or deceleration of a movement defines within it intensive parts that must be called greater or smaller, even while these undergo a change of nature and following the order of these changes, ordered differences. In this sense, difference in depth is composed of distances, distance being not an extensive quantity but an indivisible asymmetrical relation, ordinal and intensive in character, which is established between series of heterogeneous terms and expresses at each moment the nature of that which does not divide without changing its nature. By contrast with extensive quantities, intensive quantities are therefore defined by the enveloping difference, the enveloped distances, and the unequal in itself, which testifies to the existence of a natural remainder which provides the material for a change of nature. We must henceforth distinguish between two types of multiplicities, such as those represented by distances and lengths respectively, implicit as opposed to explicit multiplicities, those whose metric varies with division and those which carry the invariable principle of their metric. Difference, distance and inequality are the positive characteristics of depth as intensive spatium. Furthermore, the movement of explication is the movement by which difference tends to be cancelled, but also by which distances tend to be extended and developed into lengths, and the divisible tends to be equalized. Once again, Plato's greatness lies in having seen that the divisible formed a nature in itself only by including the unequal. We could be criticized for having included all differences in kind within intensity, thereby inflating it with everything that normally belongs to quality. Equally, we could be criticized for having included within distances what normally belongs to extensive quantities. To us, these criticisms do not appear well-founded. It is true that in being developed in extension, difference becomes simple difference of degree and no longer has its reason in itself. It is true that quality benefits from that alienated reason and takes over differences in kind. However, the distinction between the two, like that between mechanism and qualitativism, rests upon a sleight of hand. The one profits from what has disappeared in the other, but the true difference belongs to neither. Difference becomes qualitative only in the process by which it is cancelled in extension. In its own nature, difference is no more qualitative than extensive. We should note, first, that qualities have much more stability, immobility and generality than is often admitted. They are orders of resemblance. Certainly they differ, and differ in kind, but always within a supposed order of resemblance. Moreover, their variations in resemblance refer to variations of a quite different sort. Certainly, a qualitative difference does not reproduce or express a difference of intensity. However, in the passage from one quality to another, even where there is a maximum of resemblance or continuity, there are phenomena of delay and plateau, shocks of difference, distances, a whole play of conjunctions and disjunctions, a whole depth which forms a graduated scale rather than a properly qualitative duration. Finally, if intensity were not there to attend to, support and relay quality, what would the duration attributed to quality be but a race to the grave? What time would it have other than the time necessary for the annihilation of difference in the corresponding extensity, or the time necessary for the uniformization of qualities themselves? In short, there would no more be qualitative differences or differences in kind than there would be quantitative differences or differences of degree, if intensity were not capable of constituting the former in qualities and the latter in extensity, even at the risk of appearing to extinguish itself in both. This is why the Bergsonian critique of intensity seems unconvincing. It assumes qualities ready-made and extensities already constituted. It distributes difference into differences in kind in the case of qualities and differences in degree in the case of extensity. From this point of view, intensity necessarily appears as no more than an impure mixture, no longer sensible or perceptible. However, Bergson has thereby already attributed to quality everything that belongs to intensive quantities. He wanted to free quality from the superficial movement which ties it to contrariety or contradiction. That is why he opposed duration to becoming, but he could do so only by attributing to quality a depth which is precisely that of intensive quantity. One cannot be against both the negative and intensity at once. It is striking that Bergson should define qualitative duration not as indivisible but as that which changes its nature in dividing, that which does not cease to divide and change its nature, virtual multiplicity, he says, in opposition to the actual multiplicities of number and extensity which retain only differences of degree. There comes a moment, however, in this philosophy of difference which the whole of Bergsonism represents, when Bergson raises the question of the double genesis of quality and extensity. This fundamental differentiation, quality-extensity, can find its reason only in the great synthesis of memory which allows all the degrees of difference to coexist as degrees of relaxation and contraction, and rediscovers at the heart of duration the implicated order of that intensity which had been denounced only provisionally and from without. For the differences of degree and the extensity which represents them mechanically do not carry their reason within themselves, but neither do the differences in kind and the duration which represents them qualitatively. The soul of mechanism says that everything is difference of degree. The soul of quality replies that there are differences in kind everywhere. However, these are false souls, minor and auxiliary souls. Let us take seriously the famous question, is there a difference in kind, or of degree, between differences of degree and differences in kind? Neither. Difference is a matter of degree only within the extensity in which it is explicated, it is a matter of kind only with regard to the quality which covers it within that extensity. Between the two are all the degrees of difference, beneath the two lies the entire nature of difference, in other words, the intensive. Differences of degree are only the lowest degree of difference, and differences in kind are the highest form of difference. What differences in kind or of degree separate or differentiate? The degrees or nature of difference make the same, but the same which is said of the different. Bergson, as we have seen, went as far as this extreme conclusion, perhaps this same, the identity of nature and degrees of difference, is repetition, ontological repetition. There is an illusion tied to intensive quantities. This illusion, however, is not intensity itself, but rather the movement by which difference in intensity is cancelled. Nor is it only apparently cancelled. It is really cancelled, but outside itself, in extensity and underneath quality. We must therefore distinguish two orders of implication or degradation, a secondary implication which designates the state in which intensities are enveloped by the qualities and extensity which explicate them, and a primary implication designating the state in which intensity is implicated in itself, at once both enveloping and enveloped. In other words, a secondary degradation in which difference in intensity is cancelled, the highest rejoining the lowest, and a primary power of degradation in which the highest affirms the lowest. The illusion is precisely the confusion of these two instances or extrinsic and intrinsic states. How could it be avoided from the point of view of the empirical exercise of sensibility, since the latter can grasp intensity only in the order of quality and extensity? Only transcendental inquiry can discover that intensity remains implicated in itself and continues to envelop difference at the very moment when it is reflected in the extensity and the quality that it creates, which implicate it only secondarily, just enough to explicate it. Extensity, quality, limitation, opposition indeed designate realities, but the form which difference assumes here is illusory. Difference pursues its subterranean life while its image reflected by the surface is scattered. Moreover, it is in the nature of that image, but only that image, to be scattered, just as it is in the nature of the surface to cancel difference, but only on the surface. We asked how a transcendental principle might be extracted from the empirical principles of Carnot or Curie. When we seek to define energy in general, either we take account of the extensive and qualified factors of extensity, in which case we are reduced to saying there is something which remains constant, thereby formulating the great but flat tautology of the identical, or, on the contrary, we consider pure intensity insofar as it is implicated in that deep region where no quality is developed, or any extensity deployed. In this case, we define energy in terms of the difference buried in this pure intensity, and it is the formula difference of intensity which bears the tautology, but this time the beautiful and profound tautology of the different. Energy in general will not then be confused with a uniform energy at rest, which would render any transformation impossible. Only a particular form of empirical energy, qualified in extensity, can be at rest, one in which the difference in intensity is already cancelled because it is drawn outside itself and distributed among the elements of the system. However, energy in general or intensive quantity is the spatium, the theatre of all metamorphosis or difference in its which envelops all its degrees in the production of each. In this sense, energy or intensive quantity is a transcendental principle, not a scientific concept. In terms of the distinction between empirical and transcendental principles, an empirical principle is the instance which governs a particular domain. Every domain is a qualified and extended partial system, governed in such a manner that the difference of intensity which creates it tends to be cancelled within it, law of nature. But the domains are distributive and cannot be added. There is no more an extensity in general than there is an energy in general within extensity. On the other hand, there is an intensive space with no other qualification, and within this space a pure energy. The transcendental principle does not govern any domain but gives the domain to be governed to a given empirical principle. It accounts for the subjection of a domain to a principle. The domain is created by difference of intensity, and given by this difference to an empirical principle according to which and in which the difference itself is cancelled. It is the transcendental principle which maintains itself in itself, beyond the reach of the empirical principle. Moreover, while the laws of nature govern the surface of the world, the eternal return ceaselessly rumbles in this other dimension of the transcendental or the volcanic spatium. When we say that the eternal return is not the return of the same, or of the similar or the equal, we mean that it does not presuppose any identity. On the contrary, it is said of the world without identity, without resemblance or equality. It is said of the world the very ground of which is difference, in which everything rests upon disparities, upon differences of differences which reverberate to infinity. The world of intensity. The eternal return is itself the identical, the similar and the equal, but it presupposes nothing of itself in that of which it is said. It is said of that which has no identity, no resemblance and no equality. It is the identical which is said of the different, the resemblance which is said of the pure disparate, the equal which is said only of the unequal and the proximity which is said of all distances. Things must be dispersed within difference, and their identity must be dissolved before they become subject to eternal return and to identity in the eternal return. We can therefore measure the chasm which separates eternal return as a modern belief, or even a belief of the future, from eternal return as an ancient or supposedly ancient belief. In fact, it is a meager achievement on the part of our philosophy of history to oppose what is taken to be our historical time with the cyclical time supposed to be that of the ancients. It is supposed that for the ancients things revolve, whereas for we moderns they progress in a straight line. However, this opposition between cyclical and linear time is a weak idea. Every time such a schema is tested it fails for several reasons. In the first place, the eternal return that is attributed to the ancients presupposes the identity in general of that which it is supposed to make return. This return of the identical, however, is subject to certain conditions which contradict it in fact. For it is grounded either upon the cyclical transformation of qualitative elements into one another, physical eternal return, or upon the circular movement of incorruptible celestial bodies, astronomical eternal return. In both cases, return is presented as a law of nature. In the one case, it is interpreted in terms of quality, in the other case, in terms of extensity. However, whether astronomical or physical, extensive or qualitative, this interpretation of eternal return has already reduced the identity that it presupposes to a simple and very general resemblance, for the same qualitative process, or the same respective position of the stars determine only very crude resemblances among the phenomena they govern. Moreover, eternal return is here so badly understood that it is opposed to what is intimately connected with it. On the one hand, with the ideal of an exit from the wheel of births, it finds a first qualitative limit in the form of metamorphoses and transmigrations. On the other hand, with the irreducible inequality of the celestial periods, it finds a second quantitative limit in the form of irrational numbers. Thus the two themes most profoundly linked to eternal return, that of qualitative metamorphosis and that of quantitative inequality, are turned back against it, having lost all intelligible relation to it. We are not saying that eternal return as it was believed by the ancients is erroneous or unfounded. We are saying that the ancients only approximately and partially believed in it. It was not so much an eternal return as a system of partial cycles and cycles of resemblance. It was a generality, in short, a law of nature. Even the great year of Heraclitus was only the time necessary for that part of fire which constituted a living being to transform itself into earth and back into fire. Alternatively, if there is, in Greece or elsewhere, a genuine knowledge of eternal return, it is a cruel and esoteric knowledge which must be sought in another dimension, more mysterious and more uncommon than that of astronomical or qualitative cycles and their generalities. Why did Nietzsche, who knew the Greeks, know that the eternal return was his own invention, an untimely belief or belief of the future? Because his eternal return is in no way the return of a same, a similar or an equal. Nietzsche says clearly that if there were identity, if there were an undifferentiated qualitative state of the world or a position of equilibrium for the stars, then this would be a reason never to leave it, not a reason for entering into a cycle. Nietzsche thereby links eternal return to what appeared to oppose it or limit it from without, namely, complete metamorphosis, the irreducibly unequal. Depth, distance, caves, the lower depths, the tortuous, and the unequal in itself form the only landscape of the eternal return. Zarathustra reminds the buffoon as well as the eagle and the serpent that it is not an astronomical refrain, nor a physical circle. It is not a law of nature. The eternal return is elaborated within a groundlessness in which original nature resides in its chaos, beyond the jurisdictions and laws which constitute only second nature. Nietzsche opposes his hypothesis to the cyclical hypothesis, his depth to the absence of depth in the sphere of the immutable. The eternal return is neither qualitative nor extensive but intensive, purely intensive. In other words, it is said of difference. This is the fundamental connection between the eternal return and the will to power. The one does not hold without the other. The will to power is the flashing world of metamorphoses, of communicating intensities, differences, of breaths, insinuations and exhalations, a world of intensive intentionalities, a world of simulacra or mysteries. Eternal return is the being of this world, the only same which is said of this world and excludes any prior identity therein. It is true that Nietzsche was interested in the energetics of his time, but this was not the scientific nostalgia of a philosopher. We must discover what it was that he sought to find in the science of intensive quantities, namely, the means to realize what he called Pascal's prophecy, to make chaos an object of affirmation. Difference in the will to power is the highest object of sensibility, the host among, sensed against the laws of nature. Remember that their will to power was first presented as a feeling of distance. A thought contrary to the laws of nature. Repetition in the eternal return is the highest thought, the gross Gedanke. Difference is the first affirmation, eternal return is the second, the eternal affirmation of being or the nth power which is said of the first. It is always on the basis of a signal, or, in other words, a primary intensity that thought occurs. Along the broken chain or the tortuous ring we are violently led from the limit of sense to the limit of thought, from what can only be sensed to what can only be thought. It is because nothing is equal, because everything bathes in its difference, its dissimilarity and its inequality, even with itself, that everything returns, or rather, everything does not return. What does not return is that which denies eternal return, that which does not pass the test. It is quality and extensity which do not return, insofar as within them difference, the condition of eternal return, is cancelled. So too the negative, insofar as difference is thereby inverted and cancelled. So too the identical, the similar and the equal, insofar as these constitute the forms of indifference. So too God, along with Himself as the form and guarantee of identity, everything which appears only under the law of once and for all, including repetition when it is subject to the condition of the identity of a same quality, a same extended body, a same self, as in the resurrection. Does this truly mean that neither quality nor extensity returns? Or were we not, rather, led to distinguish two states of quality along with two states of extension? One in which quality flashes like a sign in the distance or interval created by a difference of intensity, the other in which, as an effect, it reacts upon its cause and tends to cancel difference. One in which extension remains implicated in the enveloping order of differences, the other in which extensity explicates difference and cancels it within a qualified system. This distinction, which cannot be drawn within experience, becomes possible from the point of view of the thought of eternal return. The hard law of explication is that what is explicated once and for all. The ethics of intensive quantities has only two principles, affirm even the lowest, do not explicate oneself too much. We must be like the father who criticized the child for having uttered all the dirty words he knew, not only because it was wrong but because he had said everything at once, because he kept nothing in reserve, no remainder for the subtle, implicated matter of the eternal return. Moreover, if the eternal return reduces qualities to the status of pure signs, and retains of extensities only what combines with the original depth, even at the cost of our coherence and in favor of a superior coherence, then the most beautiful qualities will appear, the most brilliant colors, the most precious stones and the most vibrant extensions. For once reduced to their seminal reasons, and having broken all relation with the negative, these will remain forever affixed in the intensive space of positive differences. Then, in turn, the final prediction of the Phaedo will be realized, in which Plato promised to the sensibility disconnected from its empirical exercise temples, stars and gods such as had never before been seen, unheard of affirmations. The prediction is realized, it is true, only by the very overturning of Platonism. The affinity between intensive quantities and differentials has often been denied. Such criticism, however, bears only upon a misconception of this affinity. This should be grounded not upon the consideration of a series, the terms of a series and the differences between consecutive terms, but upon the confrontation between two types of relation. Differential relations in the reciprocal synthesis of the idea and relations of intensity in the asymmetrical synthesis of the sensible. The reciprocal synthesis deftly is continued in the asymmetrical synthesis which connects y to x. The intensive factor is a partial derivative or the differential of a composite function. A whole flow of exchange occurs between intensity and ideas, as though between two corresponding figures of difference. Ideas are problematic or perplexed virtual multiplicities, made up of relations between differential elements. Intensities are implicated multiplicities, emplexes, made up of relations between asymmetrical elements which direct the course of the actualization of ideas and determine the cases of solution for problems. The aesthetic of intensities thus develops each of its moments in correspondence with the dialectic of ideas. The power of intensity, depth, is grounded in the potentiality of the idea. Already the illusion we encountered on the level of the aesthetic repeats that of the dialectic, and the form of the negative is the shadow projected by problems and their elements before it is the inverted image of intensive differences. Just as intensive quantities seem to be cancelled, so problematic ideas seem to disappear. The unconscious of little perceptions or intensive quantities refers to the unconscious of ideas, and the art of the aesthetic echoes that of the dialectic. The latter is irony, understood as the art of problems and questions which is expressed in the handling of differential relations and in the distribution of the ordinary and the singular. By contrast, the art of the aesthetic is humor, a physical art of signals and signs determining the partial solutions or cases of solution, in short, an implicated art of intensive quantities. These very general correspondences do not, nevertheless, indicate precisely how the affinity works, nor how the connection between intensive quantities and differentials operates. Let us reconsider the movement of ideas, which is inseparable from a process of actualization. For example, an ideal multiplicity such as that of color is constituted by the virtual coexistence of relations between genetic or differential elements of a particular order. These relations are actualized in qualitatively distinct colors, while their distinctive points are incarnated in distinct extensities which correspond to these qualities. The qualities are therefore differentiated, along with the extensities, insofar as these represent divergent lines along which the differential relations which coexist only in the idea are actualized. We have seen that every process of actualization was in this sense a double differentiation, qualitative and extensive. The categories of differentiation no doubt change according to the order of the differentials constitutive of the idea. Qualification and partition are the two aspects of physical actualization, just as organization and the determination of species are of biological actualization. However, the qualities differentiated by virtue of the relations they actualize impose their own requirements, as do the extensities differentiated by virtue of the distinctive points they incarnate. That is why we proposed the concept of differentiation to indicate at once both the state of differential relations in the idea or virtual multiplicity, and the state of the qualitative and extensive series in which these are actualized by being differentiated. Thereby, however, the condition of such actualization remains completely indeterminate. How is the idea determined to incarnate itself in differentiated qualities and differentiated extensities? What determines the relations coexisting within the idea to differentiate themselves in qualities and extensities? The answer lies precisely in the intensive quantities. Intensity is the determinant in the process of actualization. It is intensity which dramatizes. It is intensity which is immediately expressed in the basic spatiotemporal dynamisms and determines an indistinct differential relation in the idea to incarnate itself in a distinct quality and a distinguished extensity. In this way, after a fashion, but, as we shall see, only after a fashion, the movement and the categories of differentiation reproduce those of explication. We speak of differentiation in relation to the idea which is actualized. We speak of explication in relation to the intensity which develops and which, precisely, determines the movement of actualization. However, it remains literally true that intensity creates the qualities and extensities in which it explicates itself, because these qualities and extensities do not in any way resemble the ideal relations which are actualized within them. Differentiation implies the creation of the lines along which it operates. How does intensity fulfill this determinant role? In itself, It must be no less independent of the differentiation than of the explication which proceeds from it. It is independent of the explication by virtue of the order of implication which defines it. It is independent of the differentiation by virtue of its own essential process. The essential process of intensive quantities is individuation. Intensity is individuating, and intensive quantities are individuating factors. Individuals are signal sign systems. All individuality is intensive, and therefore serial, stepped and communicating, comprising and affirming in itself the difference in intensities by which it is constituted. Gilbert Simondon has shown recently that individuation presupposes a prior metastable state, in other words, the existence of a disparateness such as at least two orders of magnitude or two scales of heterogeneous reality between which potentials are distributed. Such a pre-individual state nevertheless does not lack singularities. The distinctive or singular points are defined by the existence and distribution of potentials. An objective problematic field thus appears, determined by the distance between two heterogeneous orders. Individuation emerges like the act of solving such a problem, or, what amounts to the same thing, like the actualization of a potential and the establishing of communication between disparates. The act of individuation consists not in suppressing the problem, but in integrating the elements of the disparateness into a state of coupling which ensures its internal resonance. The individual thus finds itself attached to a pre-individual half which is not the impersonal within it so much as the reservoir of its singularities. In all these respects, we believe that individuation is essentially intensive, and that the pre-individual field is a virtual ideal field, made up of differential relations. Individuation is what responds to the question who, just as the idea responds to the questions how much and how. Who is always an intensity. Individuation is the act by which intensity determines differential relations to become actualized, along the lines of differentiation and within the qualities and extensities it creates. The total notion is therefore that of indi-different/chiation, indi-drama different/chiation. Irony, as the art of differential ideas, is by no means unaware of singularity. On the contrary, it plays upon the entire distribution of ordinary and distinctive points. However, it is always a question of pre-individual singularities distributed within the idea. It is unaware of the individual. Humor, the art of intensive quantities, plays upon the individual and individuating factors. Humor bears witness to the play of individuals as cases of solution, in relation to the differentiations it determines, whereas irony, for its part, proceeds to the differentiations necessary within the calculation of problems or the determination of their conditions. The individual is neither a quality nor an extension. The individual is neither a qualification nor a partition, neither an organization nor a determination of species. The individual is no more an infima species than it is composed of parts. Qualitative or extensive interpretations of individuation remain incapable of providing reasons why a quality ceases to be general, or why a synthesis of extensity begins here and finishes there. The determination of qualities and species presupposes individuals to be qualified, while extensive parts are relative to an individual rather than the reverse. It is not sufficient, however, to mark a difference in kind between individuation and differentiation in general. This difference in kind remains unintelligible so long as we do not accept the necessary consequence, that individuation precedes differentiation in principle, that every differentiation presupposes a prior intense field of individuation. It is because of the action of the field of individuation that such and such differential relations and such distinctive points, pre-individual fields, are actualized, in other words, organized within intuition along lines differentiated in relation to other lines. As a result, they then form the quality, number, species and parts of an individual, in short, its generality. Because there are individuals of different species and individuals of the same species, there is a tendency to believe that individuation is a continuation of the determination of species, albeit of a different kind and proceeding by different means. In fact, any confusion between the two processes, any reduction of individuation to a limit or complication of differentiation, compromises the whole of the philosophy of difference. This would be to commit an error, this time in the actual, analogous to that made in confusing the virtual with the possible. Individuation does not presuppose any differentiation, it gives rise to it. Qualities and extensities, forms and matters, species and parts are not primary, they are imprisoned in individuals as though in a crystal. Moreover, the entire world may be read, as though in a crystal ball, in the moving depth of individuating differences or differences in intensity. All differences are borne by individuals, but they are not all individual differences. Under what conditions does a difference become regarded as individual? The problem of classification was clearly always a problem of ordering differences. However, plant and animal classifications show that we can order differences only so long as we are provided with a multiple network of continuity of resemblance. The idea of a continuity among living beings was never distinct from that of classification, much less opposed to it. It was not even an idea supposed to limit or nuance the demands of classification. On the contrary, it is the prerequisite of any possible classification. For example, one asks which among several differences is the one which truly forms a characteristic, in other words, the one which allows to be grouped under a reflected identity those beings which resemble one another on a maximum number of points. It is in this sense that a genus may be simultaneously both a concept of reflection and also a natural concept, to the extent that the identity it carves out is related to that of neighboring species. If we consider three plants, A, B and C, of which A and B are ligneous while C is non-ligneous, B and C are blue while A is red, then ligneous will be the characteristic, since it ensures the greatest subordination of differences to the order of increasing and decreasing resemblances. No doubt the order of resemblances may be denounced as belonging to crude perception. This, however, is so only on condition that one substitutes for units of reflection the great constitutive units, either Cuvier's great functional units or Geoffroy's great units of composition, in relation to which difference is still understood in terms of judgments of analogy or in terms of variation within a universal concept. In any case, so long as it is subordinated to the criteria of resemblance within perception, identity within reflection, analogy within judgment and opposition within the concept, difference is not regarded as individual difference. It remains only general difference, even though it is borne by the individual. Darwin's great novelty, perhaps, was that of inaugurating the thought of individual difference. The leitmotif of the origin of species is, we do not know what individual difference is capable of. We do not know how far it can go, assuming that we add to it natural selection. Darwin's problem is posed in terms rather similar to those employed by Freud on another occasion. It is a question of knowing under what conditions small, unconnected or free-floating differences become appreciable, connected and fixed differences. Natural selection indeed plays the role of a principle of reality, even of success, and shows how differences become connected to one another and accumulate in a given direction, but also how they tend to diverge further and further in different or even opposed directions. Natural selection plays an essential role, the differentiation of difference, survival of the most divergent. Where selection does not occur or no longer occurs, differences remain or once more become free-floating. Where it occurs, it does so to fix the differences and make them diverge. The great taxonomic units, genera, families, orders and classes, no longer provide a means of understanding difference by relating it to such apparent conditions as resemblances, identities, analogies and determined oppositions. On the contrary, these taxonomic units are understood on the basis of such fundamental mechanisms of natural selection as difference and the differentiation of difference. For Darwin, no doubt, individual difference does not yet have a clear status, to the extent that it is considered for itself and as primary matter of selection or differentiation, understood as free-floating or unconnected difference, it is not distinguished from an indeterminate variability. That is why Weismann makes an essential contribution to Darwinism when he shows how individual difference finds a natural cause in sex reproduction as the principle of the incessant production of varied individual differences. To the extent that sexual differentiation itself results from sex reproduction, we see that the three great biological differentiations, that of species, that of organic parts and that of the sexes, turn around individual difference, not vice versa. These are the three figures of the Copernican revolution of Darwinism. The first concerns the differentiation of individual differences in the form of the divergence of characteristics and the determination of groups. The second concerns the connection of differences in the form of the coordination of characteristics within the same group. The third concerns the production of differences as the continuous matter of differentiation and connection. In appearance, well-founded appearance, certainly, sex reproduction is subordinated to the criteria of the species and the demands of the organic parts. It is true that the egg must reproduce all the parts of the organism to which it belongs. It is also more or less true that sexed reproduction operates within the limits of the species. However, it has often been noticed that all modes of reproduction imply phenomena of organic differentiation. The egg reconstitutes the parts only on condition that it develops within a field which does not depend upon them. It develops within the limits of the species only on condition that it also presents phenomena of specific to differentiation. Only beings of the same species can effectively overcome the limits of the species and produce beings which function as sketches, provisionally reduced to supraspecific characteristics. This is what von Baer discovered when he showed that an embryo does not reproduce ancestral adult forms belonging to other species, but rather experiences or undergoes states and undertakes movements which are not viable for the species but go beyond the limits of the species, genus, order or class, and can be sustained only by the embryo itself, under the conditions of embryonic life. Baer concludes that epigenesis proceeds from more to less general, in other words, from the most general types to generic and specific determinations. However, this high level of generality has nothing to do with an abstract taxonomic concept since it is, as such, lived by the embryo. It refers, on the one hand, to the differential relations which constitute the virtuality which exists prior to the actualization of the species. On the other hand, it refers to the first movements of that actualization, and particularly to its condition, namely, individuation as it finds its field of constitution in the egg. The highest generalities of life, therefore, point beyond species and genus, but point beyond them in the direction of the individual and pre-individual singularities rather than towards an impersonal abstraction. If we notice, with Baer, that not only the type but also the specific form of the embryo appears very early, we should not necessarily take this to indicate the irreducibility of types and branchings, but rather the speed and relative acceleration of the influence exercised by individuation upon actualization or the determination of species. It is not the individual which is an illusion in relation to the genius of the species, but the species which is an illusion, inevitable and well-founded, it is true, in relation to the play of the individual and individuation. The question is not whether in fact the individual can be separated from its species and its parts. It cannot. However, does not this very inseparability, along with the speed of appearance of the species and its parts, testify to the primacy in principle of individuation over differentiation? It is the individual which is above the species, and precedes the species in principle. Moreover, the embryo is the individual as such directly caught up in the field of its individuation. Sex reproduction defines this very field, if it is accompanied in the product by an all the more precocious apparition of the specific form. This is because the very notion of the species depends first upon sexed reproduction, which accelerates the movement of the unfolding of actualization by individuation. The egg itself is already the site of the first developments. The embryo is a sort of phantasm of its parents. Every embryo is a chimera, capable of functioning as a sketch and of living that which is unlivable for the adult of every species. It undertakes forced movements, constitutes internal resonances and dramatizes the primordial relations of life. The problem of comparison between animal and human sexuality consists of finding out how sexuality ceases to be a function and breaks its attachments to reproduction, for human sexuality interiorizes the conditions of the production of phantasms. Dreams are our eggs, our larvae and our properly psychic individuals. The vital egg is nevertheless already a field of individuation, and the embryo is a pure individual, and the one in the other testifies to the primacy of individuation over actualization, in other words, over both organization and the determination of species. Individuating difference must be understood first within its field of individuation, not as belated, but as in some sense in the egg. Since the work of Child and Weiss, we recognize the axes or planes of symmetry within an egg. Here too, however, the positive element lies less in the elements of the given symmetry than in those which are missing. An intensity forming a wave of variation throughout the protoplasm distributes its difference along the axes and from one pole to another. The region of maximal activity is the first to come into play, exercising a dominant influence on the development of the corresponding parts at a lower rate. The individual in the egg is a genuine descent, going from the highest to the lowest and affirming the differences which comprise it and in which it falls. In a young amphibian gastrula the intensity seems to be maximal in a mid-sublast-temporal region and to decrease in all directions, but less rapidly towards the animal pole. In the middle layer of a young vertebrate the intensity decreases, for each transverse section, from the mid-dorsal to the mid-ventral line. In order to plumb the intensive depths or the spatium of an egg, the directions and distances, the dynamisms and dramas, the potentials and potentialities must be multiplied. The world is an egg. Moreover, the egg, in effect, provides us with a model for the order of reasons, organic and species-related, differentiation, individuation, dramatization, differentiation. We think that difference of intensity, as this is implicated in the egg, expresses first the differential relations or virtual matter to be organized. This intensive field of individuation determines the relations that it expresses to be incarnated in spatio-temporal dynamisms, dramatization, in species which correspond to these relations, specific differentiation, and in organic parts which correspond to the distinctive points in these relations, organic differentiation. Individuation always governs actualization. The organic parts are induced only on the basis of the gradients of their intensive environment, the types determined in their species only by virtue of the individuating intensity. Throughout, intensity is primary in relation to organic extensions and to species qualities. Notions such as morphogenetic potential, field gradient threshold put forward by Deleuze, which essentially concern the relations of intensity as such, account for this complex ensemble. This is why the question of the comparative role of the nucleus and the cytoplasm, in the egg as in the world, is not easily solved. The nucleus and the genes designate only the differentiated matter, in other words, the differential relations which constitute the pre-individual field to be actualized, but their actualization is determined only by the cytoplasm, with its gradients and its fields of individuation. Species do not resemble the differential relations which are actualized in them. Organic parts do not resemble the distinctive points which correspond to these relations. Species and parts do not resemble the intensities which determine them. As Deleuze says, when a caudal appendix is induced by its intensive environment, that appendix corresponds to a certain level of morphogenetic potential and depends upon a system in which nothing is a priori caudal. The egg destroys the model of similitude. To the extent that the requirements of resemblance disappear, two quarrels seem to lose much of their meaning. On the one hand, preformism and epigenesis cease to be opposed once we admit that the enveloped preformations are intensive while the developed formations are qualitative and extensive, and that they do not resemble one another. On the other hand, fixism and evolutionism tend to be reconciled to the extent that movement does not go from one actual term to another, nor from general to particular, but, by the intermediary of a determinant individuation, from the virtual to its actualization. Nevertheless, we have not advanced with regard to the principal difficulty. We invoke a field of individuation or individuating difference as the condition of the organization and determination of species. However, this field of individuation is posited only formally and in general. It seems to be the same for a given species, and to vary in intensity from one species to another. It seems, therefore, to depend upon the species and the determination of species, and to refer us once more to differences borne by the individual, not to individual differences. In order for this difficulty to disappear, the individuating difference must not only be conceived within a field of individuation in general, but must itself be conceived as an individual difference. The form of the field must be necessarily and in itself filled with individual differences. This plenitude must be immediate, thoroughly precocious and not delayed in the egg, to such a degree that the principle of indiscernibles would indeed have the formula given it by Lucretius, no two eggs or grains of wheat are identical. These conditions, we believe, are fully satisfied in the order of implication of intensities. Intensities presuppose and express only differential relations, individuals presuppose only ideas. Furthermore, the differential relations within ideas are not more species, or genera, or families, etc., than their distinctive points form parts. They by no means constitute either qualities or extensions. On the contrary, all the ideas, all the relations with their variations and points, coexist, even though there are changes of order according to the elements considered. They are fully determined and differentiated even though they are completely undifferentiated. Such a mode of distinction seemed to us to correspond to the publication of ideas, in other words, to their problematic character and to the reality of the virtual which they represent. This is why ideas have the logical character of being simultaneously both distinct and obscure. They are obscure, undifferentiated and coexisting with other ideas, publicated with them, insofar as they are distinct, omni modo determinata. The question then is what happens when ideas are expressed by intensities or individuals in this new dimension of implication. Intensity or difference in itself thus expresses differential relations and their corresponding distinctive points. It introduces a new type of distinction into these relations and between ideas a new type of distinction. Henceforward, the ideas, relations, variations in those relations and distinctive points are in a sense separated. Instead of coexisting, they enter states of simultaneity or succession. Nevertheless, all the intensities are implicated in one another, each in turn both enveloped and enveloping, such that each continues to express the changing totality of ideas, the variable ensemble of differential relations. However, each intensity clearly expresses only certain relations or certain degrees of variation. Those that it expresses clearly are precisely those on which it is focused when it has the enveloping role. In its role as the enveloped, it still expresses all relations and all degrees, but confusedly. As the two roles are reciprocal, and as intensity is in the first instance enveloped by itself, it must be said that the clear and the confused, as logical characteristics in the intensity which expresses the idea, in other words, in the individual which thinks it, are no more separable than the distinct and the obscure are separable in the idea itself. The dear confused as individuating intensive unit corresponds to the distinct obscure as ideal unit. Clear confused does not qualify the idea, but the thinker who thinks or expresses it. The thinker is the individual. The distinct was precisely the obscure, it was the obscure insofar as it was distinct. In the present case, however, the clear is precisely the confused, it is confused insofar as it is clear. We saw that the weakness of the theory of representation, from the point of view of the logic of knowledge, was to have established a direct proportion between the clear and the distinct, at the expense of the inverse proportion which relates these two logical values. The entire image of thought was compromised as a result. Only Leibniz approached the conditions of a logic of thought, inspired by his theory of individuation and expression. For despite the complexity and ambiguity of the texts, it does indeed seem at times that the expressed, the continuum of differential relations or the unconscious virtual idea, should be in itself distinct and obscure. For example, all the drops of water in the sea like so many genetic elements with the differential relations, the variations in these relations and the distinctive points they comprise. In addition, it seems that the expresser, the perceiving, imagining or thinking individual, should be by nature clear and confused. For example, our perception of the noise of the sea, which confusedly includes the whole and clearly expresses only certain relations or certain points by virtue of our bodies and a threshold of consciousness which they determine. The order of implication includes the enveloping no less than the enveloped, depth as well as distance. When an enveloping intensity clearly expresses certain differential relations and certain distinctive points, it still expresses confusedly all the other relations, all their variations and points. It expresses these in the intensities it envelops. These latter enveloped intensities are then within the former. The enveloping intensities, depth, constitute the field of individuation, the individuating differences. The enveloped intensities, distances, constitute the individual differences. The latter necessarily fill the former. Why is the enveloping intensity already a field of individuation? Because the differential relation on which it is focused is not yet a species, nor are its distinctive points yet parts. They will become so, but only in being actualized by the action of this field which it constitutes. Must we say at least that all the individuals of a given species have the same field of individuation, since they point originally to the same relation? Certainly not, for while two individuating intensities may be abstractly the same by virtue of their clear expression, they are never the same by virtue of the order of intensities which they envelop or the relations which they confusedly express. There is a variable order according to which the ensemble of relations is diversely implicated in these secondary intensities. We should nevertheless avoid saying that an individual has individual difference only by virtue of its confused sphere. This would be again to neglect the indissolubility of the clear and the confused. It would be to forget that the clear is confused by itself, insofar as it is clear. In effect, the secondary intensities represent the fundamental property of the primary intensities, namely, the power to divide and changing their nature. Two intensities are never identical except abstractly. Rather, they differ in kind, if only by the manner in which they divide within the intensities they include. Finally, we should not say that the individuals of a given species are distinguished by their participation in other species, as if, for example, there was ass or lion, wolf or sheep, in every human being. There is indeed all that, and metempsychosis retains all its symbolic truth. However, the ass and the wolf can be considered species only in relation to the fields of individuation which clearly express them. In the confused and in the enveloped, they play only the role of variables, of individual differences or composing souls. That is why Leibniz was right to substitute the notion of metaschematism for that of metempsychosis, meaning by this that a soul never changed bodies, but its body could be re-enveloped or re-implicated in order to enter, if need be, other fields of individuation, thereby returning to a more subtle theatre. Every body, everything, thinks and is a thought to the extent that, reduced to its intensive reasons, it expresses an idea the actualization of which it determines. However, the thinker himself makes his individual differences from all manner of things. It is in this sense that he is laden with stones and diamonds, plants and even animals. The thinker, undoubtedly the thinker of eternal return, is the individual, the universal individual. It is he who makes use of all the power of the clear and the confused, of the clear confused, in order to think ideas in all their power as the distinct obscure. The multiple, mobile and communicating character of individuality, its implicated character, must therefore be constantly recalled. The indivisibility of the individual pertains solely to the property of intensive quantities not to divide without changing nature. We are made of all these depths and distances, of these intensive souls which develop and are enveloped. We call individuating factors the ensemble of these enveloping and enveloped intensities, of these individuating and individual differences which ceaselessly interpenetrate one another throughout the fields of individuation. Individuality is not a characteristic of the self but, on the contrary, forms and sustains the system of the dissolved self. We must give a more precise account of the relations between explication and differentiation. Intensity creates the extensities and the qualities in which it is explicated. These extensities and qualities are differentiated. Extensities are formally distinct from one another, and comprise within themselves the distinctions between parts corresponding to the distinctive points. Qualities are materially distinct, and comprise the distinctions corresponding to the variations of relations. Creation is always the production of lines and figures of differentiation. It is nevertheless true that intensity is explicated only in being cancelled in this differentiated system that it creates. Equally, we notice that the differentiation of a system occurs by linkage with a more general system which is dedifferentiated. In this sense, even living beings do not contradict the empirical principle of degradation, and the local differentiations are compensated by an overall tendency towards uniformity, in exactly the same way as a final cancellation compensates the originary creations. We nevertheless see that very important variations occur from one domain to the next. Physical and biological systems are distinguished first by the order of the ideas they incarnate or actualize, differentials of this or that order. Secondly, they are distinguished by the process of individualization which determines that actualization, in a physical system, this happens all at once, and affects only the boundaries, whereas a biological system receives successive waves of singularities and involves its whole internal milieu in the operations which take place at the outer limits. Finally, they are distinguished by the figures of differentiation which represent actualization itself, organization and the determination of biological species as opposed to simple physical qualification and distribution. Nevertheless, whatever the domain under consideration, the law of explication remains the cancellation of productive difference and the erasure of the differentiation produced which is manifest in physical equilibrium as well as in biological death. Once again, the principle of degradation is never negated or contradicted. Yet if it explicates everything, it accounts for nothing. As has been said, if everything goes into this principle, nothing comes out. If nothing contradicts it, if there is no counter-order or exception, then there are, on the contrary, many things of another order. While local increases in entropy may be compensated by a more general degradation, they are in no way comprised in or produced by the latter. Empirical principles tend to leave out the elements of their own foundation. The principle of degradation obviously does not account either for the creation of the most simple system or for the evolution of systems, the threefold difference between biological systems and physical ones. The living therefore testifies to the existence of another order, a heterogeneous order of another dimension, as though the individuating factors or the atoms taken individually with their power of mutual communication and fluent instability there enjoyed a higher degree of expression. What is the formula for this evolution? The more complex a system, the more the values peculiar to implication appear within it. The presence of these values is what allows a judgment of the complexity or the complication of a system, and determines the preceding characteristics of biological systems. The values of implication are centers of envelopment. These centers are not the intensive individuating factors themselves, but they are their representatives within a complex whole in the process of explication. It is these which constitute the little islands and the local increases of entropy at the heart of systems which nevertheless conform overall to the principle of degradation. Atoms taken individually, for example, even though they nonetheless confirm the law of increasing entropy when considered en masse in the order of explication of the system in which they are implicated. Insofar as it testifies to individual actions between directed molecules, an organism such as a mammal may be assimilated to a microscopic being. The function of these centers may be defined in several ways. First, to the extent that the individuating factors form a kind of noumenon of the phenomenon, we claim that the noumenon tends to appear as such in complex systems, that it finds its own phenomenon in the centers of envelopment. Second, to the extent that sense is tied to the ideas which are incarnated and to the individuations which determine that incarnation, we claim that these centers are expressive, or that they reveal sense. Finally, to the extent that every phenomenon finds its reason in a difference of intensity which frames it, as though this constituted the boundaries between which it flashes, we claim that complex systems increasingly tend to interiorize their constitutive differences. The centers of envelopment carry out this interiorization of the individuating factors. The more the difference on which the system depends is interiorized in the phenomenon, the more repetition finds itself interior, the less it depends upon external conditions which are supposed to ensure the reproduction of the same differences. As the movement of life shows, difference and repetition tend to become interiorized in signal-sign systems both at once. Biologists are right when, in posing the problem of heredity, they avoid allocating distinct functions, such as variation and reproduction, to these systems, but rather seek to show the underlying unity or reciprocal conditioning of these functions. At this point, the theories of heredity necessarily open onto a philosophy of nature. It is as if repetition were never the repetition of the same but always of the different as such, and the object of difference in itself or repetition. At the moment when they are explicated in a system, once and for all, the differential, intensive or individuating factors testify to their persistence in implication, and to eternal return as the truth of that implication. Mute witnesses to degradation and death, the centers of envelopment are also the dark precursors of the eternal return. Here again, it is the mute witnesses or dark precursors which do everything, or, at least, it is in these that everything happens. Speaking of evolution necessarily leads us to psychic systems. For each type of system, we must ask what pertains to ideas and what pertains to implication, individuation and explication differentiation respectively. With psychic systems the problem assumes a particular urgency, since it is by no means certain that either the I or the self falls within the domain of individuation. They are, rather, figures of differentiation. The I forms the properly psychic determination of species, while the self forms the psychic organization. The I is the quality of human being as a species. The determination of psychic species is not of the same type as the determination of biological species, since here the determination must equal, or be of the same power as, the determinable. That is why Descartes refused any definition of human being which would proceed by genus and difference as in the case of animal species, for example, rational animal. On the contrary, he presents the I think as another procedure of definition, one capable of demonstrating the specificity of humanity or the quality of its substance. In correlation with the I, the self must understand itself in extension. The self designates the properly psychic organism, with its distinctive points represented by the diverse faculties which enter into the comprehension of the I. As a result, the fundamental psychic correlation is expressed in the formula I think myself, just as the biological correlation is expressed in the complementarity of species and their parts, of quality and extension. That is why both the I and the self each begin with differences, but these differences are distributed in such a way as to be cancelled, in accordance with the requirements of good sense and common sense. The I therefore appears at the end as the universal form of psychic life, just as the self is the universal matter of that form. The I and the self explicate one another, and do so endlessly throughout the entire history of the cogito. The individuating factors or the implicated factors of individuation therefore have neither the form of the I nor the matter of the self. This is because the I is inseparable from a form of identity, while the self is indistinguishable from a matter constituted by a continuity of resemblances. The differences included within the I and the self are, without doubt, born by individuals, nevertheless, they are not individual or individuating to the extent that they are understood in relation to this identity in the I and this resemblance in the self. By contrast, every individuating factor is already difference and difference of difference. It is constructed upon a fundamental disparity, and functions on the edges of that disparity as such. That is why these factors endlessly communicate with one another across fields of individuation, becoming enveloped in one another in a domain which disrupts the matter of the self as well as the form of the I. Individuation is mobile, strangely supple, fortuitous and endowed with fringes and margins, all because the intensities which contribute to it communicate with each other, envelop other intensities and are in turn enveloped. The individual is far from indivisible, never ceasing to divide and change its nature. It is not a self with regard to what it expresses, for it expresses ideas in the form of internal multiplicities, made up of differential relations and distinctive points or pre-individual singularities. Nor is it an I with regard to its expressive character, for here again it forms a multiplicity of actualization, as though it were a condensation of distinctive points or an open collection of intensities. The fringe of indetermination which surrounds individuals and the relative, floating and fluid character of individuality itself has often been commented upon. For example, the case of two physical particles whose individuality can no longer be observed when their fields of individuation or domains of presence encroach upon one another, or the case of the biological distinction between an organ and an organism which depends on the situation of the corresponding intensities according to whether or not these are enveloped within a larger field of individuation. The error, however, is to believe that this indetermination or this relativity indicates something incomplete in individuality or something interrupted in individuation. On the contrary, they express the full, positive power of the individual as such, and the manner in which it is distinguished in nature from both an I and a self. The individual is distinguished from the I and the self just as the intense order of implications is distinguished from the extensive and qualitative order of explication. Indeterminate, floating, fluid, communicative and enveloped are so many positive characteristics affirmed by the individual. It is therefore insufficient to multiply selves or to attenuate the I in order to discover the true status of individuation. We have seen to what extent selves must be presupposed as a condition of passive organic syntheses, already playing the role of mute witnesses. However, the synthesis of time which is carried out in them refers precisely to other syntheses as though to other witnesses, thereby leading us into the domain of another nature in which there is no longer either self or I, and in which, by contrast, we encounter the chaotic realm of individuation. For each self still retains some resemblance in its matter, while each I retains an identity, however attenuated. However, that which has its ground in dissemblance, or its lack of ground in a difference of difference, does not fit the categories of the I and the self. The great discovery of Nietzsche's philosophy, which marks his break with Schopenhauer and goes under the name of the will to power or the Dionysian world, is the following: no doubt the I and the self must be replaced by an undifferentiated abyss, but this abyss is neither an impersonal nor an abstract universal beyond individuation. On the contrary, it is the I and the self which are the abstract universals. They must be replaced, but in and by individuation, in the direction of the individuating factors which consume them and which constitute the fluid world of Dionysus. What cannot be replaced is individuation itself. Beyond the self and the I we find not the impersonal but the individual and its factors, individuation and its fields, individuality and its pre-individual singularities. For the pre-individual is still singular, just as the anti-self and the anti-I are still individual, or, rather than simply still, we should say finally. That is why the individual in intensity finds its psychic image neither in the organization of the self nor in the determination of species of the I, but rather in the fractured I and the dissolved self, and in the correlation of the fractured I with the dissolved self. This correlation seems clear, like that of the thinker and the thought, or that of the dear confused thinker with distinct obscure ideas, the Dionysian thinker. It is ideas which lead us from the fractured I to the dissolved self. As we have seen, what swarms around the edges of the fracture are ideas in the form of problems, in other words, in the form of multiplicities made up of differential relations and variations of relations, distinctive points and transformations of points. These ideas, however, are expressed in individuating factors, in the implicated world of intensive quantities which constitute the universal concrete individuality of the thinker or the system of the dissolved self. Death is inscribed in the I and the self, like the cancellation of difference in a system of explication, or the degradation which compensates for the processes of differentiation. From this point of view, death may well be inevitable, but every death is nonetheless accidental and violent, and always comes from without. Simultaneously, however, death has quite another face hidden among the individuating factors which dissolve the self. Here it is like a death instinct, an internal power which frees the individuating elements from the form of the I or the matter of the self in which they are imprisoned. It would be wrong to confuse the two faces of death, as though the death instinct were reduced to a tendency towards increasing entropy or a return to inanimate matter. Every death is double, and represents the cancellation of large differences in extension as well as the liberation and swarming of little differences in intensity. Freud suggested the following hypothesis: the organism wants to die, but to die in its own way, so that real death always presents itself as a foreshortening, as possessing an accidental, violent and external character which is anathema to the internal will to die. There is a necessary non-correspondence between death as an empirical event and death as an instinct or transcendental instance. Freud and Spinoza are both right, one with regard to the instinct, the other with regard to the event. Desired from within, death always comes from without in a passive and accidental form. Suicide is an attempt to make the two incommensurable faces coincide or correspond. However, two sides do not meet, and every death remains double. On the one hand, it is a differentiation which compensates for the differentiations of the I and the self in an overall system which renders these uniform. On the other hand, it is a matter of individuation, a protest by the individual which has never recognized itself within the limits of the self and the I, even where these are universal. There must nonetheless be values of implication in psychic systems in the process of being explicated. In other words, there must be centers of envelopment which testify to the presence of individuating factors. These centers are clearly constituted neither by the I nor by the self, but by a completely different structure belonging to the I-self system. This structure should be designated by the name mother. It refers only to the self for the other I and the other I for the self. Theories tend to oscillate mistakenly and ceaselessly from a pole at which the other is reduced to the status of object to a pole at which it assumes the status of subject. Even Sartre was content to inscribe this oscillation in the other as such, in showing that the other became object when I became subject, and did not become subject unless I in turn became object. As a result, the structure of the other, as well as its role in psychic systems, remained misunderstood. The other who is nobody, but who is self for the other and the other for the self in two systems, the a priori other is defined in each system by its expressive value, in other words, its implicit and enveloping value. Consider a terrified face, under conditions such that I do not see and do not experience the causes of this terror. This face expresses a possible world, the terrifying world. By expression we mean, as always, that relation which involves a torsion between an expressor and unexpressed such that the expressed does not exist apart from the expressor, even though the expressor relates to it as though to something completely different. By possible, therefore, we do not mean any resemblance but that state of the implicated or enveloped in its very heterogeneity with what envelops it. The terrified face does not resemble what terrifies it, it envelops a state of the terrifying world. In every psychic system there is a swarm of possibilities around reality, but our possibles are always others. The other cannot be separated from the expressivity which constitutes it. Even when we consider the body of another as an object, its ears and eyes as anatomical pieces, we do not remove all expressivity from them even though we simplify in the extreme the world they express. The eye is an implicated light or the expression of a possible light, while the ear is that of a possible sound. Concretely, however, it is the so-called tertiary qualities whose mode of existence is in the first instance enveloped by the other. The I and the self, by contrast, are immediately characterized by functions of development or explication. Not only do they experience qualities in general as already developed in the extensity of their system, but they tend to explicate or develop the world expressed by the other, either in order to participate in it or to deny it. I unravel the frightened face of the other, I either develop it into a frightening world, a reality of which seizes me, or I denounce its unreality. However, these relations of development, which form our commonalities as well as our disagreements with the other, also dissolve its structure and reduce it either to the status of an object or to the status of a subject. That is why, in order to grasp the other as such, we were right to insist upon special conditions of experience, however artificial, namely, the moment at which the expressed has, for us, no existence apart from that which expresses it, the other as the expression of a possible world. In the psychic system of the I-self, the other thus functions as a center of enwinding, envelopment or implication. It is the representative of the individuating factors. Moreover, if an organism may be regarded as a microscopic being, how much more is this true of the other in psychic systems? It gives rise to local increases in entropy, whereas the explication of the other by the self represents a degradation in accordance with law. The rule invoked earlier, not to be explicated too much meant, above all, not to explicate oneself too much with the other, not to explicate the other too much, but to maintain one's implicit values and multiply one's own world by populating it with all those expresseds that do not exist apart from their expressions. For it is not the other which is another I, but the I which is another, a fractured I. There is no love which does not begin with the revelation of a possible world as such, in wound in the other which expresses it. Albertine's face expressed the blending of beach and waves. From what unknown world does she distinguish me? The entire history of that exemplary love is the long explication of the possible worlds expressed by Albertine, which transform her now into a fascinating subject, now into a deceptive object. It is true that the other disposes of a means to endow the possibles that it expresses with reality, independently of the development we cause them to undergo. This means is language. Words offered by the other confer reality on the possible as such, whence the foundation of the lie inscribed within language itself. It is this role of language as a result of the values of implication or the centers of envelopment which endows it with its powers within internal resonance systems. The structure of the other and the corresponding function of language effectively represent the manifestation of the noumenon, the appearance of expressive values, in short, the tendency towards the interiorization of difference. Conclusion. Difference is not and cannot be thought in itself, so long as it is subject to the requirements of representation. The question whether it was always subject to these requirements, and for what reasons, must be closely examined. But it appears that pure disparates formed either the celestial beyond of a divine understanding inaccessible to our representative thought, or the infernal and unfathomable for us below of a notion of dissemblance. In any case, difference in itself appears to exclude any relation between different and different which would allow it to be thought. It seems that it can become thinkable only when tamed, in other words, when subject to the four iron collars of representation, identity in the concept, opposition in the predicate, analogy in judgment and resemblance in perception. As Foucault has shown, the classical world of representation is defined by these four dimensions which coordinate and measure it. These are the four roots of the principle of reason, the identity of the concept which is reflected in a ratio cognoscendi, the opposition of the predicate which is developed in a ratio fiendi, the analogy of judgment which is distributed in a ratio ascendi, and the resemblance of perception which determines a ratio agendi. Every other difference, every difference which is not rooted in this way, is an unbounded, uncoordinated and inorganic difference, too large or too small, not only to be thought but to exist. Ceasing to be thought, difference is dissipated in non-being. From this, it is concluded that difference in itself remains condemned and must atone or be redeemed under the auspices of a reason which renders it livable and thinkable, and makes it the object of an organic representation. The greatest effort of philosophy was perhaps directed at rendering representation infinite, orgiastic. It is a question of extending representation as far as the too large and the too small of difference, of adding a hitherto unsuspected perspective to representation, in other words, inventing theological, scientific and aesthetic techniques which allow it to integrate the depth of difference in itself, of allowing representation to conquer the obscure, of allowing it to include the vanishing of difference which is too small and the dismemberment of difference which is too large, of allowing it to capture the power of giddiness, intoxication and cruelty, and even of death. In short, it is a question of causing a little of Dionysus's blood to flow in the organic veins of Apollo. This effort has always permeated the world of representation. The ultimate wish of the organic is to become orgiastic and to conquer the in itself, but this effort found two culminating moments in Deleuze and Hegel. With the former, representation conquers the infinite because a technique for dealing with the infinitely small captures the smallest difference and its disappearance. With the latter, representation conquers the infinite because a technique for dealing with the infinitely large captures the largest difference and its dismembering. The two are in agreement, since the Hegelian problem is also that of disappearance, while the Deleuzean problem is also that of dismembering. Hegel's technique lies in the movement of contradiction. Difference must attain that point, it must be extended that far. It consists of inscribing the inessential in the essence, and in conquering the infinite with the weapons of a synthetic finite identity. Deleuze's technique lies in the movement we call distinction. It consists in constructing the essence from the inessential, and conquering the finite by means of an infinite analytic identity. Difference must be developed to that point. But what is the point of making representation infinite? It retains all its requirements. All that is discovered is a ground which relates the excess and default of difference to the identical, the similar, the analogous and the opposed. Reason, that is, sufficient reason, has become the ground which no longer allows anything to escape. Nothing, however, has changed. Difference remains subject to malediction, and all that has happened is the discovery of more subtle and more sublime means to make it atone, or to redeem it and subject it to the categories of representation. Thus, Hegelian contradiction appears to push difference to the limit, but this path is a dead end which brings it back to identity, making identity the sufficient condition for difference to exist and be thought. It is only in relation to the identical, as a function of the identical, that contradiction is the greatest difference. The intoxications and giddinesses are feigned, the obscure is already clarified from the outset. Nothing shows this more clearly than the insipid monocentricity of the circles in the Hegelian dialectic. Moreover, in another manner perhaps the same should be said of the condition of convergence in the Leibnizian world. Take a notion such as that of Leibnizian incompossibility. Everyone recognizes that incompossibility is not reducible to contradiction, and compossibility is not reducible to the identical. It is indeed in this sense that the compossible and the incompossible testify to a specific sufficient reason and to a presence of the infinite, not only in the totality of possible worlds, but in each chosen world. It is more difficult to say in what these new notions consist. It seems to us that compossibility consists uniquely in the following: the condition of a maximum of continuity for a maximum of difference, in other words, a condition of convergence of established series around the singularities of the continuum. Conversely, the incompossibility of worlds is decided in the vicinity of those singularities which give rise to divergent series between themselves. In short, representation may well become infinite, it nevertheless does not acquire the power to affirm either divergence or decentering. It requires a convergent and monocentric world, a world in which one is only apparently intoxicated, in which reason acts the drunkard and sings a Dionysian tune while none the less remaining pure reason. The ground or sufficient reason is nothing but a means of allowing the identical to rule over infinity itself, and allowing the continuity of resemblance, the relation of analogy and the opposition of predicates to invade infinity. This is the originality of sufficient reason, better to ensure the subjection of difference to the quadripartite yoke. The damage is done not only by the requirement of finite representation, which consists of fixing a propitious moment for difference, neither too large nor too small, in between excess and default, but also by the apparently contrary requirement of infinite representation, which purports to integrate the infinitely large and the infinitely small of difference, excess and default themselves. The entire alternative between finite and infinite applies very badly to difference, because it constitutes only an antinomy of representation. We saw this, moreover, in the case of calculus. Modern finitist interpretations betray the nature of the differential no less than the former infinitist interpretations, because both fail to capture the extra-propositional or sub-representative source, in other words, the problem from which the calculus draws its power. In addition, the alternative of the small and the large, whether in finite representation which excludes both, or in infinite representation which wants to include both, and each within the other, does not, in general, fit difference. The reason is that this alternative expresses only the oscillations of representation with regard to an always dominant identity, or rather the oscillations of the identical with regard to an always rebellious matter, the excess and default of which it sometimes rejects and sometimes tries to integrate. Finally, returning to Leibniz and Hegel and their common attempt to extend representation to infinity, we are not sure that Leibniz does not go farthest, nor that, of the two, he is not the least theological. His conception of the idea as an ensemble of differential relations and singular points, the manner in which he begins with the inessential and constructs essences in the form of centers of envelopment around singularities, his presentiment of divergences, his procedure of vice diction, his approximation to an inverse ratio between the distinct and the clear, all show why the ground rumbles with greater power in the case of Leibniz, why the intoxication and giddiness are less feigned in his case, why obscurity is better understood and the Dionysian shores are closer. What motivated the subordination of difference to the requirements of finite or infinite representation? It is correct to define metaphysics by reference to Platonism, but insufficient to define Platonism by reference to the distinction between essence and appearance. The primary distinction which Plato rigorously establishes is the one between the model and the copy. The copy, however, is far from a simple appearance, since it stands in an internal, spiritual, noological and ontological relation with the idea or model. The second and more profound distinction is the one between the copy itself and the phantasm. It is clear that Plato distinguishes, and even opposes, models and copies only in order to obtain a selective criterion with which to separate copies and simulacra, the former founded upon their relation to the model while the latter are disqualified because they fail both the test of the copy and the requirements of the model. While there is indeed appearance, it is rather a matter of distinguishing the splendid and well-grounded Apollonian appearances from the other, insinuative, malign and maleficent appearances which respect the ground no more than the grounded. This Platonic wish to exorcise simulacra is what entails the subjection of difference. For the model can be defined only by a positing of identity as the essence of the same, auto kath auto, and the copy by an affection of internal resemblance, the quality of the similar. Moreover, because the resemblance is internal, the copy must itself have an internal relation to being and the true which is analogous to that of the model. Finally, the copy must be constructed by means of a method which, given two opposed predicates, attributes to it the one which agrees with the model. In all these ways, copies are distinguished from simulacra only by subordinating difference to instances of the same, the similar, the analogous and the opposed. No doubt with Plato these instances are not yet distributed as they will be in the deployed world of representation, from Aristotle onwards. Plato inaugurates and initiates because he evolves within a theory of ideas which will allow the deployment of representation. In his case, however, a moral motivation in all its purity is avowed. The will to eliminate simulacra or phantasms has no motivation apart from the moral. What is condemned in the figure of simulacra is the state of free, oceanic differences, of nomadic distributions and crowned anarchy, along with all that malice which challenges both the notion of the model and that of the copy. Later, the world of representation will more or less forget its moral origin and presuppositions. These will nevertheless continue to act in the distinction between the originary and the derived, the original and the sequel, the ground and the grounded, which animates the hierarchies of a representative theology by extending the complementarity between model and copy. Representation is a site of transcendental illusion. This illusion comes in several forms, four interrelated forms which correspond particularly to thought, sensibility, the idea and being. In effect, thought is covered over by an image made up of postulates which distort both its operation and its genesis. These postulates culminate in the position of an identical thinking subject, which functions as a principle of identity for concepts in general. A slippage occurs in the transition from the Platonic world to the world of representation, which again is why we can present Plato as the origin or at the crossroads of a decision. The sameness of the Platonic idea which serves as model and is guaranteed by the good gives way to the identity of an originary concept grounded in a thinking subject. The thinking subject brings to the concept its subjective concomitants, memory, recognition and self-consciousness. Nevertheless, it is the moral vision of the world which is thereby extended and represented in this subjective identity affirmed as a common sense, cogitatio naturae universalis. When difference is subordinated by the thinking subject to the identity of the concept, even where this identity is synthetic, difference in thought disappears. In other words, what disappears is the difference that thinking makes in thought, that genitality of thinking, that profound fracture of the I which leads it to think only in thinking its own passion, and even its own death, in the pure and empty form of time. To restore difference in thought is to untie this first knot which consists of representing difference through the identity of the concept and the thinking subject. The second illusion concerns the subordination of difference to resemblance. Given the manner in which it is distributed in representation, resemblance need no longer be just that between copy and model. It can be determined as the resemblance of the diverse, sensible to itself, in such a way that the identity of the concept should be applicable to it, and receive from it in turn the possibility of specification. The illusion takes the following form: difference necessarily tends to be cancelled in the quality which covers it, while at the same time inequality tends to be equalized within the extension in which it is distributed. The theme of quantitative equality or equalization doubles that of qualitative resemblance and assimilation. As we saw, this was the illusion of good sense, complementary to the preceding illusion and its common sense. It is a transcendental illusion because it is entirely true that difference is cancelled qualitatively and in extension. It is nevertheless an illusion, since the nature of difference lies neither in the quality by which it is covered nor in the extensity by which it is explicated. Difference is intensive, indistinguishable from depth in the form of a non-extensive and non-qualified spatium, the matrix of the unequal and the different. Intensity is not the sensible but the being of the sensible, where different relates to different. To restore difference within intensity as the being of the sensible is to untie the second knot, one which subordinates difference to the similar within perception, allowing it to be experienced only on condition that there is an assimilation of diversity taken as raw material for the identical concept. The third illusion concerns the negative and the manner in which it subordinates difference to itself, in the form of both limitation and opposition. The second illusion already prepared us for this discovery of a mystification on the part of the negative. It is in quality and extensity that intensity is inverted and appears upside down, and its power of affirming difference is betrayed by the figures of quantitative and qualitative limitation, qualitative and quantitative opposition. Limitation and opposition are first and second dimension surface effects, whereas the living depths, the diagonal, is populated by differences without negation. Beneath the platitude of the negative lies the world of disparateness. The origin of the illusion which subjects difference to the false power of the negative must therefore be sought, not in the sensible world itself, but in that which acts in depth and is incarnated in the sensible world. We have seen that ideas are genuine objectivities, made up of differential elements and relations and provided with a specific mode, namely, the problematic. Problems thus defined do not designate any ignorance on the part of a thinking subject, any more than they express a conflict, but rather objectively characterize the nature of ideas as such. There is indeed, therefore, a me-on, which must not be confused with the ukon, and which means the being of the problematic and not the being of the negative, an expletive ne rather than a negative not. This me-on is so called because it precedes all affirmation, but is nonetheless completely positive. Problems ideas are positive multiplicities, full and differentiated positivities described by the process of complete and reciprocal determination which relates problems to their conditions. The positivity of problems is constituted by the fact of being posited, thereby being related to their conditions and fully determined. It is true that, from this point of view, problems give rise to propositions which give effect to them in the form of answers or cases of solution. These propositions in turn represent affirmations, the objects of which are those differences which correspond to the relations and the singularities of the differential field. In this sense, we can establish a distinction between the positive and the affirmative, in other words, between the positivity of ideas understood as differential positings and the affirmations to which they give rise, which incarnate and solve them. With regard to the latter, we should say not only that they are different affirmations but that they are affirmations of differences, as a consequence of the multiplicity which belongs to each idea. Affirmation, understood as the affirmation of difference, is produced by the positivity of problems understood as differential positings. Multiple affirmation is produced by problematic multiplicity. It is of the essence of affirmation to be in itself multiple and to affirm difference. As for the negative, this is only the shadow cast upon the affirmations produced by a problem. Negation appears alongside affirmation like a powerless double, albeit one which testifies to the existence of another power, that of the effective and persistent problem. Everything, however, is reversed if we begin with the propositions which represent these affirmations in consciousness. For problems ideas are by nature unconscious, they are extra-propositional and sub-representative, and do not resemble the propositions which represent the affirmations to which they give rise. If we attempt to reconstitute problems in the image of or as resembling conscious propositions, then the illusion takes shape, the shadow awakens and appears to acquire a life of its own. It is as though each affirmation referred to its negative, or has sense only by virtue of its negation, while at the same time a generalized negation, anukon, takes the place of the problem and its me-on. Thus begins the long history of the distortion of the dialectic, which culminates with Hegel and consists in substituting the labor of the negative for the play of difference and the differential. Instead of being defined by a non-ng which is the being of problems and questions, the dialectical instance is now defined by a non-being which is the being of the negative. The false genesis of affirmation, which takes the form of the negation and is produced by the negative, is substituted for the complementarity of the positive and the affirmative, of differential positing and the affirmation of difference. Furthermore, if the truth be told, none of this would amount to much were it not for the moral presuppositions and practical implications of such a distortion. We have seen all that this valorization of the negative signified, including the conservative spirit of such an enterprise, the platitude of the affirmations supposed to be engendered thereby, and their manner in which we are led away from the most important task, that of determining problems and realizing in them our power of creation and decision. That is why conflicts, oppositions and contradictions seem to us to be surface effects and conscious epiphenomena, while the unconscious lived on problems and differences. History progresses not by negation and the negation of negation, but by deciding problems and affirming differences. It is no less bloody and cruel as a result. Only the shadows of history live by negation. The good enter into it with all the power of a posited differential or a difference affirmed. They repel shadows into the shadows and deny only as the consequence of a primary positivity and affirmation. For them, as Nietzsche says, affirmation is primary, it affirms difference, while the negative is only a consequence or a reflection in which affirmation is doubled. That is why real revolutions have the atmosphere of fates. Contradiction is not the weapon of the proletariat but, rather, the manner in which the bourgeoisie defends and preserves itself, the shadow behind which it maintains its claim to decide what the problems are. Contradictions are not resolved, they are dissipated by capturing the problem of which they reflect only the shadow. The negative is always a conscious reaction, a distortion of the true agent or actor. As a result, as long as it remains within the limits of representation, philosophy is prey to the theoretical antinomies of consciousness. The choice whether difference must be understood as quantitative limitation or qualitative opposition is no less devoid of sense than that between the small and the large. For whether it is limitation or opposition, difference is unjustly assimilated to a negative non-being. Whence another illusory choice, either being is full positivity, pure affirmation, but undifferentiated being, without difference, or being includes differences, it is difference and there is non-being, a being of the negative. All these antinomies are connected, and depend upon the same illusion. We must say both that being is full positivity and pure affirmation, and that there is non-being which is the being of the problematic, the being of problems and questions, not the being of the negative. In truth, the origin of the antinomies is as follows. Once the nature of the problematic and the multiplicity which defines the idea is misrecognized, once the idea is reduced to the same or even to the identity of a concept, the negative takes wing. Instead of the positive process of determination in the idea, what emerges is a process of opposition of contrary predicates or limitation of primary predicates. To restore the differential in the idea, and difference to the affirmation which flows from it, is to break this unholy bond which subordinates difference to the negative. Finally, the fourth illusion concerns the subordination of difference to the analogy of judgment. In effect, the identity of the concept does not yet give us a concrete rule of determination, since it appears only as the identity of an indeterminate concept, being or I am, that I am which Kant said was the perception or the feeling of an existence independently of any determination. The ultimate concepts or primary and originary predicates must therefore be posited as determinable. They are recognized by the fact that each maintains an internal relation to being. In this sense, these concepts are analogues, or being is analogous in relation to them and acquires simultaneously the identity of a distributive common sense and that of an ordinal good sense. We have seen how analogy took two forms, which rested not upon equality but upon the interiority of the relation of judgment. It is not sufficient, therefore, that representation be grounded upon the identity of an indeterminate concept. Identity must itself be represented every time in a certain number of determinable concepts. These originary concepts, in relation to which being is distributive and ordinal, are called categories or genera of being. On the basis of such categories, specific derived concepts can in turn be determined by a method of division, in other words, by the play of contrary predicates within each genus. In this manner, difference is assigned two limits, in the form of two irreducible but complementary figures which indicate precisely its belonging to representation: the large and the small, the categories as a priori concepts and the empirical concepts, the originary determinable concepts and the derived determined concepts, the analogous and the opposed, the large genera and the species. This distribution of difference in a manner entirely dependent upon the requirements of representation essentially belongs within the analogical vision of the world. However, this form of distribution commanded by the categories seemed to us to betray the nature of being, as a cardinal and collective concept, and the nature of the distributions themselves, as nomadic rather than sedentary and fixed distributions, as well as the nature of difference, as individuating difference. In terms of this distribution, the individual is only, and only understood as, that which bears differences in general, while being distributes itself among the fixed forms of these differences and is said analogically of that which is. Nevertheless, it should be noted that the four illusions of representation distort repetition no less than they distort difference, and for reasons which are in certain respects comparable. In the first place, representation provides no direct and positive criteria for distinguishing between repetition and the order of generality, resemblance or equivalence. That is why repetition is represented as a perfect resemblance or an extreme equality. Second, representation in effect invokes the identity of the concept in order to explain repetition no less than to understand difference. Difference is represented in the identical concept, and thereby reduced to a merely conceptual difference. Repetition, by contrast, is represented outside the concept, as though it were a difference without concept, but always with the presupposition of an identical concept. Thus, repetition occurs when things are distinguished in numero, in space and time, while their concept remains the same. In the same movement, therefore, the identity of the concept in representation includes difference and is extended to repetition. A third aspect follows from this: it is apparent that a repetition can no longer receive anything but a negative explanation. In effect, it is a matter of explaining the possibility of differences without concept. Or one invokes a logical imitation of the concept at each of its moments, in other words, a relative blockage such that, however far the comprehension of the concept is pushed, there is always an infinite number of things which can correspond to it, since in fact one can never encompass the infinity of that comprehension which would make every difference a conceptual difference. Repetition is then explained only in terms of a relative limitation in our representation of the concept and, from precisely this point of view, we deprive ourselves of any means of distinguishing repetition from simple resemblance. Alternatively, a real opposition is invoked, one that is capable of imposing an absolute natural blockage on the concept, by assigning to it a comprehension that is in principle necessarily finite, by defining an order external to the comprehension of even an indefinite concept, or by bringing in forces opposed to the subjective concomitants of the infinite concept, memory, recognition, self-consciousness. We have seen how these three cases seemed to be illustrated respectively by nominal concepts, concepts of nature and concepts of freedom, words, nature and the unconscious. In all these cases, thanks to the distinction between absolute natural blockage and artificial or logical blockage, there is no doubt that we have the means to distinguish between repetition and simple resemblance, since things are said to repeat when they differ even though their concept is absolutely the same. However, not only this distinction but repetition itself is explained here in an entirely negative fashion. It, language, repeats because it, the words, is not real, because there is no definition other than nominal. It, nature, repeats because it, matter, has no interiority, because it is parts extra parts. It, the unconscious, repeats because it, the ego, represses, because it, the it, has no memory, no recognition and no consciousness of itself ultimately because it has no instinct, instinct being the subjective concomitant of the species as concept. In short, things repeat always by virtue of what they are not and do not have. We repeat because we do not hear. As Kierkegaard said, it is the repetition of the deaf, or rather for the deaf, deafness of words, deafness of nature, deafness of the unconscious. Within representation, the forces which ensure repetition, in other words, a multiplicity of things for a concept absolutely the same, can only be negatively determined. Fourth, repetition is not only defined in relation to the absolute identity of the concept, it must, in a certain manner, itself represent this identical concept. A phenomenon corresponding to the analogy of judgment emerges here. Repetition is not content with multiplying instances of the same concept, it puts the concept outside itself and causes it to exist in so many instances high et nunc. It fragments identity itself, just as Democritus fragmented the one being of Parmenides and multiplied it into atoms. Or, rather, the multiplication of things under an absolutely identical concept has as its consequence the division of the concept into absolutely identical things. Matter realizes this state of the concept outside itself or the infinitely repeated element. That is why the model of repetition is indistinguishable from pure matter understood as the fragmentation of the identical or the repetition of a minimum. Repetition, therefore, has a primary sense from the point of view of representation, namely, that of a material and bare repetition, a repetition of the same, and not only under the same concept. All the other senses will be derived from this extrinsic model. In other words, every time we encounter a variant, a difference, a disguise or a displacement, we will say that it is a matter of repetition, but only in a derivative and analogical manner. Even in the case of Freud, the prodigious conception of repetition in psychic life is dominated not only by a schema of opposition in the case of the theory of repression, but by a material model in that of the death instinct. This extrinsic material model, however, takes repetition as already accomplished and presents it to a spectator who contemplates it from without. It suppresses the thickness in which repetition occurs and unfolds, even in the case of matter and death. Whence the attempt, by contrast, to represent disguise and displacement as the constituent elements of repetition, but on condition that repetition is confounded with analogy itself. Identity is no longer that of an element but, in accordance with the traditional signification, that of a relation between distinct elements or a relation between relations. Earlier, physical matter provided repetition with its primary sense, and the other senses, biological, psychic, metaphysical, were said by analogy. Now, analogy by itself is the logical matter of repetition, providing it with a distributive sense. However, it is still a sense understood in relation to a thought identity or to a represented equality, with the result that a repetition remains a concept of reflection which ensures the distribution and the displacement of terms, the transportation of the element, but only within representation and for a spectator who remains extrinsic. To ground is to determine. But what is determination, and upon what is it exercised? Grounding is the operation of the logos, or of sufficient reason. As such, it has three senses. In its first sense, the ground is the same or the identical. It enjoys supreme identity, that which is supposed to belong to ideas or to the autokathauto. What it is, and what it possesses, it is and it possesses primarily, in the utmost. What, apart from courage, would be courageous, or virtuous apart from virtue. What the ground has too. Ground, therefore, is only the claim of those who come after, all those who at best possess secondarily. It is always a claim or an image that requires a ground or appeals to a ground. For example, the claim of men to be courageous, to be virtuous, in short, to have part or to participate in, metexin means to have after. As such, we may distinguish between the ground or ideal essence, the grounded in the form of claimant or claim, and that upon which the claim bears, in other words, the quality that the ground possesses primarily and the claimant will possess secondarily, assuming that its claim is well grounded. This quality, the object of the claim, is difference, the fiancé, Ariadne. The essence or ground is the identical insofar as it originally includes the difference of its object. The operation of grounding renders the claimant similar to the ground, endowing it with resemblance from within and thereby allowing it to participate in the quality or the object which it claims. As similar to the same, the claimant is said to resemble. This, however, is not an external resemblance to the object but an internal resemblance to the ground itself. In order to have the daughter, one must resemble the father. Difference is thought here in terms of the principle of sameness and the condition of resemblance. Moreover, there will be claimants in third place, fourth place and fifth place, as many as there are images grounded in the hierarchy of this internal resemblance. That is why the ground selects and establishes the difference between the claimants themselves. Each well-grounded image or claim is called a representation, icon, since the first in the order of claims is still second in itself in relation to the foundation. It is in this sense that ideas inaugurate or ground the world of representation. As for the rebellious images which lack resemblance, simulacra, these are eliminated, rejected and denounced as ungrounded, false claimants. In a second sense, once the world of representation is established, the ground is no longer defined by the identical. The identical has become the internal character of representation itself, while resemblance has become its external relation with the thing. The identical now expresses a claim which must in turn be grounded. For the object of the claim is no longer difference understood as the quality, but that which is too large or too small in the difference, the excess and the default, in other words, the infinite. What must be grounded is the claim of representation to conquer the infinite, in order that it be indebted to no one for the daughter and capture the heart of difference. It is no longer the image which seeks to conquer difference as this seemed to be originally included in the identical, but, on the contrary, identity which seeks to conquer that which it does not include of difference. To ground no longer means to inaugurate and render possible representation, but to render representation infinite. The ground must now operate in the heart of representation, in order to extend its limits to both the infinitely small and the infinitely large. This operation is carried out by a method which ensures a monocentricity of all the possible centers of finite representation, a convergence of all the finite points of view of representation. This operation expresses sufficient reason. The latter is not identity but, rather, the means of subordinating to the identical and the other requirements of representation that part of difference which escaped them in the first sense. The two senses of the ground are nevertheless united in a third. In effect, to ground is always to bend, to curve and recurve, to organize the order of the seasons, the days and years. The object of the claim, the quality, difference, finds itself placed in a circle. The arcs of the circle are distinguished to the extent that the ground establishes moments of stasis within qualitative becoming, stoppages in between the two extremes of more and less. The claimants are distributed around the mobile circle, each receiving the lot which corresponds to the worth of its life. A life is here assimilated to a strict present which stakes its claim upon a portion of the circle, which contracts that portion and draws from it a loss or a gain in the order of more and less according to its own progression or regression in the hierarchy of images. Another present or another life contracts another portion. In Platonism we see clearly how the rotation of the circle and the distribution of lots, cycle and metempsychosis, form a grounding test or lottery. With Hegel again, however, all the possible beginnings and all the presents are distributed within the unique incessant principle of a grounding circle, which includes these in its center while it distributes them along its circumference. With Leibniz, too, compossibility itself is a circle of convergence on which are distributed all the points of view, all the presents of which the world is composed. To ground, in this third sense, is to represent the present, in other words, to make the present arrive and pass within representation, finite or infinite. The ground then appears as an immemorial memory or pure past, a past which itself was never present but which causes the present to pass, and in relation to which all the presents coexist in a circle. To ground is always to ground representation. How, then, are we to explain the ambiguity that is essential to the ground? It is as though it were attracted by the representation that it grounds, in these three senses. while at the same time it is drawn towards a beyond, as though it vacillated between a fall into the ground and an engulfment in a groundlessness, sans fond. We saw this in the case of the memory ground. It tended to represent itself as a former present and to enter into the circle which it organized in principle. Is this not the most general characteristic of the ground, namely, that the circle which it organizes is also the vicious circle of philosophical proof, in which representation must prove what proves it, just as for Kant the possibility of experience serves as the proof of its own proof? On the other hand, when transcendental memory overcomes its vertigo and maintains the irreducibility of the pure past to any present which passes in representation, it is only to see this pure past dissolve in another manner, and to see unravelled the circle on which it too simply distributes difference and repetition. In this manner, the second synthesis of time which united Eros and Mnemosyne, Eros as the seeker after memories, Mnemosyne as the treasure of the pure past, is overcome or overturned in a third synthesis, one which brings together a desexualized death instinct and an essentially amnesiac narcissistic ego within the form of empty time. Moreover, how can the ground in its other senses be protected from challenge at the hands of the simulacra and all the forces of divergence and decentering which overturn the false distributions and the false repartitions as they do the false circle and the false lottery? The world of the ground is undermined by what it tries to exclude, by the simulacrum which draws it in only to fragment it. When the ground in the first sense appeals to the idea, it is on condition that the latter be attributed an identity that it does not have by itself, but which it derives solely from the requirements of that which it claims to prove. The idea no more implies an identity than its process of actualization is explicated by resemblance. An entire multiplicity rumbles underneath the sameness of the idea. There is no doubt that describing ideas as substantive multiplicities, irreducible to any same or one, showed us how sufficient reason was capable of engendering itself independently of the requirements of representation, along the pathways of the multiple as such, by determining the elements, relations and singularities corresponding to a given idea in terms of the threefold principle of determinability, reciprocal determination and complete determination. Upon precisely what ground, however, is this multiple reason engendered and played out? In what unreason is it submerged, and from what new type of game or lottery does it draw its singularities and its distributions which remain irreducible to all that we have just seen? In short, sufficient reason or the ground is strangely bent. On the one hand, it leans towards what it grounds, towards the forms of representation; on the other hand, it turns and plunges into a groundlessness beyond the ground which resists all forms and cannot be represented. If difference is the fiancé, Ariadne, then it passes from Theseus to Dionysus, from the grounding principle to the universal ungrounding. The fact is that to ground is to determine the indeterminate, but this is not a simple operation. When determination as such occurs, it does not simply provide a form or impart form to a given matter on the basis of the categories. Something of the ground rises to the surface, without assuming any form but, rather, insinuating itself between the forms, a formless space, an autonomous and faceless existence. This ground which is now on the surface is called depth or groundlessness. Conversely, when they are reflected in it, forms decompose, every model breaks down and all faces perish, leaving only the abstract line as the determination absolutely adequate to the indeterminate, just as the flash of lightning is equal to the night, acid equal to the base, and distinction adequate to obscurity as a whole, monstrosity. A determination which is not opposed to the indeterminate and does not limit it. That is why the matter-form couple is not sufficient to describe the mechanism of determination. Matter is already informed, form is not separable from the model of the species or that of the morpher, and the whole is under the protection of the categories. In fact, this couple is completely internal to representation, serving to define its first state as this was established by Aristotle. It has already progressed to invoke the complementarity of force and the ground as the sufficient reason of form, matter and their union. More profound and threatening still is the couple formed by the abstract line and the groundlessness which dissolves matters and breaks down models. Thought understood as pure determination or abstract line must confront this indeterminate, this groundlessness. This indeterminate or groundlessness is also the animality peculiar to thought, the genitality of thought, not this or that animal form, but stupidity, bit-eyes. For if thought thinks only when constrained or forced to do so, if it remains stupid so long as nothing forces it to think, is it not also the existence of stupidity which forces it to think, precisely the fact that it does not think so long as nothing forces it to do so? Recall Heidegger's statement, what gives us most cause for thought is the fact that we do not yet think. Thought is the highest determination, confronting stupidity as though face to face with the indeterminate which is adequate to it. Stupidity, not error, constitutes the greatest weakness of thought, but also the source of its highest power in that which forces it to think. Such is the prodigious adventure of Bouvard and Picouche, or the play of sense and nonsense. As a result, determination and the indeterminate remain equal and do not progress, the one always adequate to the other, a strange repetition which ties them to the wheel, or rather to the same double pulpit. Shestov saw in Dostoevsky the outcome of the critique of pure reason in the sense of both culmination and exit. Let us for a moment be allowed to see Bouvard and Picouche as the outcome of the discourse on method. Is the cogito a stupidity? It is necessarily a nonsense to the extent that this proposition purports to state both itself and its sense. However, it is also a confusion, as Kant showed, to the extent that the determination I think purports to bear immediately on the indeterminate existence I am, without specifying the form under which the indeterminate is determinable. The subject of the Cartesian cogito does not think, it only has the possibility of thinking, and remains stupid at the heart of that possibility. It lacks the form of the determinable, not a specificity, not a specific form informing a matter, not a memory informing a present, but the pure and empty form of time. It is the empty form of time which introduces and constitutes difference in thought, on the basis of which it thinks, in the form of the difference between the indeterminate and the determination. It is this form of time which distributes throughout itself an I fractured by the abstract line, a passive self produced by a groundlessness that it contemplates. It is this which engenders thought within thought, for thought thinks only by means of difference, around this point of ungrounding. It is difference or the form of the determinable which causes thought to function, in other words, the entire machine of determination and the indeterminate. The theory of thought is like painting, it needs that revolution which took art from representation to abstraction. This is the aim of a theory of thought without image. Representation, especially when it becomes infinite, is imbued with a presentiment of groundlessness. Because it has become infinite in order to include difference within itself, however, it represents groundlessness as a completely undifferentiated abyss, a universal lack of difference, an indifferent black nothingness. For representation began by connecting individuation to the form of the I and the matter of the self. In effect, for representation the I is not only the superior form of individuation but the principle of recognition and identification for all judgments of individuality bearing upon things. It is the same wax. For representation, every individuality must be personal, I, and every singularity individual, self. Where one no longer says I, individuation also ceases, and where individuation ceases, so too does all possible singularity. Since groundlessness lacks both individuality and singularity, it is therefore necessarily represented as devoid of any difference. We see this with Schelling, with Schopenhauer, and even with the first Dionysus, that of the birth of tragedy, their groundlessness cannot sustain difference. However, the self in the form of passive self is only an event which takes place in pre-existing fields of individuation. It contemplates and contracts the individuating factors of such fields, and constitutes itself at the points of resonance of their series. Similarly, the I in the form of a fractured I allows to pass all the ideas defined by their singularities, themselves prior to fields of individuation. Just as singularity is differential, determination is pre-individual, so is individuation as individuating difference an anti-I or anti-self. The world of one or they is a world of impersonal individuations and pre-individual singularities, a world which cannot be assimilated to everyday banality but one in which, on the contrary, we encounter the final face of Dionysus, and in which resonates the true nature of that profound and that groundlessness which surrounds representation, and from which simulacra emerge. Hegel criticized Schelling for having surrounded himself with an indifferent night in which all cows are black. What a presentiment of the difference is swarming behind us, however, when in the weariness and despair of our thought without image we murmur the cows, they exaggerate, etc. How differentiated and differentiating is this blackness, even though these differences remain unidentified and barely or non-individuated, how many differences and singularities are distributed like so many aggressions, how many simulacra emerge in this night which has become white in order to compose the world of one and they. The ultimate, external illusion of representation is this illusion that results from all its internal illusions, namely, that groundlessness should lack differences, when in fact it swarms with them. What, after all, are ideas, with their constitutive multiplicity, if not these ants which enter and leave through the fracture in the I? Systems in which different relates to different through difference itself are systems of simulacra. Such systems are intensive. they rest ultimately upon the nature of intensive quantities, which precisely communicate through their differences. The fact that conditions are necessary for such communication to take place, small difference, proximity, etc., should lead us to believe not in a condition of prior resemblance, but only in the particular properties of intensive quantities which may divide, but do so only in changing their nature according to their own particular order. As for resemblance, it seems to us to result from the functioning of the system, like an effect which it would be wrong to take for a cause or condition. In short, systems of simulacra must be described with the help of notions which, from the outset, appear very different from the categories of representation. 1. The depth or spatium in which intensities are organized. 2. The disparate series these form, and the fields of individuation that they outline, individuating factors. 3. The dark precursor which causes them to communicate. 4. The linkages, internal resonances and forced movements which result. 5. The constitution of passive selves and larval subjects in the system, and the formation of pure spatio-temporal dynamisms. 6. The qualities and extensions, species and parts which form the double differentiation of the system and cover over the preceding factors. 7. The centers of envelopment which nevertheless testify to the persistence of these factors in the developed world of qualities and extensities. Systems of simulacra affirm divergence and decentering. The only unity, the only convergence of all the series, is an informal chaos in which they are all included. No series enjoys a privilege over others, none possesses the identity of a model, nor either resemblance of a copy. None is either opposed or analogous to another. Each is constituted by differences, and communicates with the others through differences of differences. Crowned anarchies are substituted for the hierarchies of representation, nomadic distributions for the sedentary distributions of representation. We saw how these systems were sites for the actualization of ideas. An idea, in this sense, is neither one nor multiple, but a multiplicity constituted of differential elements, differential relations between those elements, and singularities corresponding to those relations. These three dimensions, elements, relations and singularities, constitute the three aspects of multiple reason: determinability or the principle of quantitability, reciprocal determination or the principle of qualitability, and complete determination or the principle of potentiality. All three are projected in an ideal temporal dimension which is that of progressive determination. There is therefore an empiricism of the idea. In the most diverse cases, we must ask whether we are indeed confronted by ideal elements, in other words, elements without figure or function, but reciprocally determined within a network of differential relations, ideal non-localizable connections. For example, we must ask whether any physical particles are elements of this kind and, if so, which ones. Are biological genes such elements? Are phonemes? We must also ask what distribution of singularities, what repartitioning of singular and regular, distinctive and ordinary points, corresponds to the values of the given relations. A singularity is the point of departure for a series which extends over all the ordinary points of the system, as far as the region of another singularity which itself gives rise to another series which may either converge with or diverge from the first. Ideas have the power to affirm divergence. They establish a kind of resonance between divergent series. It is probable that the notions of singular and regular, distinctive and ordinary, have for philosophy an ontological and epistemological importance much greater than those of truth and falsity in relation to representation, for what is called sense depends upon the distinction and distribution of these shining points in the structure of a given idea. It is therefore the play of reciprocal determination from the point of view of its relations, and of complete determination from the point of view of its singularities, which makes an idea in itself progressively determinable. This play in the idea is that of the differential. It runs throughout the idea understood as multiplicity and constitutes the method of vice diction, which Sorbonne employed with such genius, even though he subordinated it to illegitimate conditions of convergence, thereby indicating the presence of a continuing pressure on the part of the requirements of representation. Ideas thus defined possess no actuality. They are pure virtuality. All the differential relations brought about by reciprocal determination, and all the repartitions of singularities brought about by complete determination, coexist according to their own particular order in the virtual multiplicities which form ideas. In the first place, ideas are incarnated in fields of individuation. The intensive series of individuating factors envelop ideal singularities which are in themselves pre-individual. The resonances between series put the ideal relations in play. Here too, Leibniz showed profoundly that the individual essences were constituted on the ground of these relations and these singularities. Second, ideas are actualized in species and parts, qualities and extensities which cover and develop these fields of individuation. A species is made up of differential relations between genes, just as the organic parts and the extensity of a body are made up of actualized pre-individual singularities. However, the absolute condition of non-resemblance must be emphasized. Neither species nor qualities resemble the differential relations that they actualize, any more than the organic parts resembled the singularities. The possible and the real resemble one another, but not the virtual and the actual. The incarnation and the actualization of ideas no more rely upon similarity or proceed by resemblance than ideas themselves possess a given identity or may be assimilated to the identical. If it is true that the two aspects of differentiation are constituted by species and parts, qualities and extensities, or rather, division and the determination of species, qualification and extension, then we should say that ideas are actualized by differentiation. For ideas, to be actualized is to be differentiated. In themselves and in their virtuality they are thus completely undifferentiated. However, they are by no means indeterminate, on the contrary, they are completely differentiated. In this sense the virtual is by no means a vague notion, but one which possesses full objective reality. It cannot be confused with the possible which lacks reality. As a result, whereas the possible is the mode of identity of concepts within representation, the virtual is the modality of the differential at the heart of ideas, the greatest importance must be attached to the distinctive feature tic as the symbol of difference. Differentiate and differentiate. The totality of the system which brings into play the idea, its incarnation and its actualization must be expressed in the complex notion of indifferent/ciation. It is as though everything has two odd, dissymmetrical and dissimilar halves, the two halves of the symbol, each dividing itself in two, an ideal half submerged in the virtual and constituted on the one hand by differential relations and on the other by corresponding singularities, an actual half constituted on the one hand by the qualities actualizing those relations and on the other by the parts actualizing those singularities. Individuation ensures the embedding of the two dissimilar halves. The question of the ens omni modo determinatum must be posed as follows. Something which exists only in the idea may be completely determined, differentiated, and yet lack those determinations which constitute actual existence. It is undifferentiated, not yet even individuated. If we call the state of a completely differentiated idea distinct, and the forms of quantitative and qualitative differentiation clear, then we must reject the rule of proportionality between the clear and the distinct. Ideas as they exist in themselves are distinct obscure. Opposed to the dear and distinct of Apollonian representation, ideas are Dionysian, existing in an obscure zone which they themselves preserve and maintain, in an indifferentiation which is nevertheless perfectly differentiated, in a pre-individuality which is nevertheless singular, the obscure zone of an intoxication which will never be calmed, the distinct obscure as the double color with which philosophy paints the world, with all the forces of a differential unconscious. It is an error to see problems as indicative of a provisional and subjective state, through which our knowledge must pass by virtue of its empirical imitations. This error liberates negation and leads to the distortion of the dialectic by substituting the non-being of the negative for the non-being of problems. The problematic is a state of the world, a dimension of the system, and even its horizon or its home. It designates precisely the objectivity of ideas, the reality of the virtual. The problem as problem is completely determined, to the extent that it is related to its perfectly positive conditions. It is necessarily differentiated, even though it may not yet be solved, and thereby remains undifferentiated. Or rather, it is solved once it is posited and determined, but still objectively persists in the solutions to which it gives rise and from which it differs in kind. That is why the metaphysics of differential calculus finds its true signification when it escapes the antinomy of the finite and the infinite in representation in order to appear in the idea as the first principle of the theory of problems. Application is what we call this state of problems ideas, with their multiplicities and coexistent varieties, their determination of elements, their distribution of mobile singularities and their formation of ideal series around these singularities. The word application here designates something other than a conscious state. Complication is what we called the state of chaos which retains and comprises all the actual intensive series which correspond to these ideal series, incarnating them and affirming their divergence. This chaos thus gathers in itself the being of the problems and distributes it to all the systems and fields which form within it the persistent value of the problematic. Implication is what we call the state of intensive series insofar as these communicate through their differences and resonate in forming fields of individuation. Each is implicated by the others, which it implicates in turn. They constitute the enveloping and the enveloped, the solving and the solved of the system. Finally, explication is what we call the state of qualities and extensities which cover and develop the system. Between the basic series, it is here that the differentiations and integrations which define the totality of the final solution are traced out. The centers of envelopment still testify to the persistence of the problems or the persistence of the values of implication in the movement which explicates and solves them, replication. We saw this in the case of the other in psychic systems. The other is not reducible to the individuating factors implicated in the system, but it represents or stands for them in a certain sense. In effect, among the developed qualities and extensities of the perceptual world, it envelops and expresses possible worlds which do not exist outside their expression. In this manner, it testifies to the persistent values of implication which confer upon it an essential function in the represented world of perception. For if the other presupposes the organization of fields of individuation, it is, on the other hand, the condition under which we perceive distinct objects and subjects in these fields, and perceive them as forming diverse kinds of identifiable and recognizable individuals. That the other should not, properly speaking, be anyone, neither you nor I, signifies that it is a structure which is implemented only by variable terms in different perceptual worlds, me for you in yours, you for me in mine. It is not even enough to see in the other a specific or particular structure of the perceptual world in general. In fact, it is a structure which grounds and ensures the overall functioning of this world as a whole. Notions necessary for the description of this world, such as those of form ground, profile unity of the object, depth length, horizon focus would remain empty and inapplicable if the other were not there to give expression to those possible worlds in which that which is, for us, in the background is pre-perceived or sub-perceived as a possible form, that which is in depth as a possible length, etc. The delineation of objects, the transitions as well as the ruptures, the passage from one object to another, and even the fact that one world disappears in favor of another, the fact that there is always something else implicated which remains to be explicated or developed, all this is made possible only by the other structure and its expressive power in perception. In short, it is the other structure that ensures individuation within the perceptual world. It is not the I, nor the self. On the contrary, these need this structure in order to be perceived as individualities. Everything happens as though the other integrated the individuating factors and pre-individual singularities within the limits of objects and subjects, which are then offered to representation as perceivers or perceived. As a result, in order to rediscover the individuating factors as they are in the intensive series along with the pre-individual singularities as they are in the idea, this path must be followed in reverse so that, departing from the subjects which give effect to the other's structure, we return as far as this structure in itself, thus apprehending the other as no one, then continue further, following the bend in sufficient reason until we reach those regions where the other structure no longer functions, far from the objects and subjects that it conditions, where singularities are free to be deployed or distributed within pure ideas, and individuating factors to be distributed in pure intensity. In this sense, it is indeed true that the thinker is necessarily solitary and solipsistic. For where do ideas come from, with their variations of relations and their distributions of singularities? Here, too, we follow the path to the bend at which reason plunges into the beyond. The ultimate origin was always assimilated to a solitary and divine game. There are several ways to play, however, and collective and human games do not resemble this solitary divine game. Several characteristics allow us to oppose the human and the ideal as two species of game. First, human games presuppose pre-existing categorical rules. Second, these rules serve to determine the probabilities, in other words, the winning and losing hypotheses. Third, these games never affirm the whole of chance, on the contrary, they fragment it and, for each case, subtract or remove the consequences of the throw from chance, since they assign this or that loss or gain as though it were necessarily tied to a given hypothesis. Finally, this is why human games proceed by sedentary distributions. In effect, the prior categorical rule here plays the invariant role of the same and enjoys a metaphysical or moral necessity. As such, it subsumes opposing hypotheses by establishing a corresponding series of numerically distinct turns or throws which are supposed to effect a distribution among them. The outcomes or results of these throws are distributed according to their consequences following a hypothetical necessity, in other words, according to the hypothesis carried out. This is sedentary distribution, in which the fixed sharing out of a distributed occurs in accordance with a proportion fixed by rules. This false and human manner of playing does not hide its presuppositions, which are moral presuppositions, the hypothesis here being that of good and evil, and the game an apprenticeship in morality. Pascal's wager is the model for this bad game, with its manner of fragmenting chance and distributing the morsels in order to separate out the modes of human existence, under the constant rule of the existence of a God who is never put in question. This conception of a game completely inscribed in the grid of necessity, of the hypothetical and hypothetical necessity, categorical or apodictic principle, hypothesis, consequence, reappears from the Platonic lottery to the Leibnizian game of chess in On the Ultimate Origination of Things. This game is indistinguishable from the practice of representation, of which it presents all the elements, the superior identity of the principle, the opposition of hypotheses, the resemblance of numerically distinct throws, and proportion in the relation between the hypothesis and the consequence. The divine game is quite different, that of which Heraclitus, perhaps, speaks, that which Malum evokes with such religious fear and repentance, and Nietzsche with such decisiveness. For us it is the most difficult game to understand, impossible to deal with in the world of representation. 5 First, there is no pre-existent rule, since the game includes its own rules. As a result, every time, the whole of chance is affirmed in a necessarily winning throw. Nothing is exempt from the game, consequences are not subtracted from chance by connecting them with a hypothetical necessity which would tie them to a determinate fragment. On the contrary, they are adequate to the whole of chance, which retains and subdivides all possible consequences. The different throws can then no longer be said to be numerically distinct. Each necessarily winning throw entails the reproduction of the act of throwing under another rule which still draws all its consequences from among the consequences of the preceding throw. Every time, the different throws are distinguished not numerically but formally, the different rules being the forms of a single ontologically unique throw, the same across all occasions. The different outcomes are no longer separated according to the distribution of the hypotheses which they carry out, but distribute themselves in the open space of the unique and non-shared throw, nomadic rather than sedentary distribution. A pure idea of play, in other words, of a game which would be nothing else but play instead of being fragmented, limited and intercut with the work of men. What is the human game closest to this solitary divine game? As Rimbaud said, look for the work of art, the variations of relations and the distributions of singularities as these occur in the idea have no origin except these rules which are formally distinct for this ontologically unique throw. This is the point at which the ultimate origin is overturned into an absence of origin, in the always displaced circle of the eternal return. An aleatory point is displaced through all the points on the dice, as though one time for all times. These different throws which invent their own rules and compose the unique throw with multiple forms and within the eternal return are so many imperative questions subtended by a single response which leaves them open and never closes them. They animate ideal problems, determining their relations and singularities. Moreover, by the intermediary of these problems they inspire the outcomes, in other words, the differentiated solutions which incarnate these relations and singularities. The world of the will, in which the entire positivity of ideas is developed between the affirmations of chance, imperative and decisive questions, and the resultant affirmations to which these give rise, decisive resolutions or cases of solution. The game of the problematic and the imperative has replaced that of the hypothetical and the categorical, the game of difference and repetition has replaced that of the same and representation. The dice are thrown against the sky, with all the force of displacement of the aleatory point, with their imperative points like lightning, forming ideal problem constellations in the sky. They fall back to earth with all the force of the victorious solutions which bring back the throw. It is a game on two tables. How could there not be a fracture at the limit or along the hinge between the two tables? And how can we recognize on the first a substantial I identical to itself, on the second a continuous self similar to itself? The identity of the player has disappeared, as has the resemblance of the one who pays the price or profits from the consequences. The fracture or hinge is the form of empty time, the aeon through which pass the throws of the dice. On one side, nothing but an I fractured by that empty form. On the other, nothing but a passive self always dissolved in that empty form. A broken earth corresponds to a fractured sky. Zero sky above me, you pure, lofty sky. This is now your purity to me. That you are to me a dance floor for divine chances, that you are to me a God's table for divine dice and dices. To which the reply on the other table, if ever I have played dice with gods at their table, the earth, so that the earth trembled and broke open and streams of fire snorted forth, For the earth is a table of the gods, and trembling with creative new words and the dice throws of the gods. Both together, however, the fractured sky and the broken earth, do not support the negative but vomit it out through that which fractures or breaks them. They expel all the forms of negation, including precisely those which represent the false game. A throw you made had failed. But what of that, you dice throwers? You have not learned to play and mock as a man ought to play and mock. We have continually proposed descriptive notions. These describe actual series, or virtual ideas, or indeed the groundlessness from which everything comes, intensity, linkage, resonance, forced movement, differential and singularity, complication, implication, explication, differentiation, individuation, differentiation, question, problem, solution, etc. None of this, however, amounts to a list of categories. It is pointless to claim that a list of categories can be open in principle. It can be in fact, but not in principle. For categories belong to the world of representation, where they constitute forms of distribution according to which being is repartitioned among beings following the rules of sedentary proportionality. That is why philosophy has often been tempted to oppose notions of a quite different kind to categories, notions which are really open and which betray an empirical and pluralist sense of ideas, existential as against essential, percepts as against concepts, or indeed the list of empirico-ideal notions that we find in Whitehead, which makes Process and Reality one of the greatest books of modern philosophy. Such notions, which must be called fantastical insofar as they apply to phantasms and simulacra, are distinguished from the categories of representation in several respects. First, they are conditions of real experience, and not only of possible experience. In this sense, because they are no larger than the conditioned, they reunite the two parts of aesthetics so unfortunately dissociated: the theory of the forms of experience and that of the work of art as experimentation. This aspect, however, does not yet allow us to determine the difference in kind between these two types of notions. Second, these types preside over completely distinct, irreducible and incompatible distributions, the nomadic distributions carried out by the fantastical notions as opposed to the sedentary distributions of the categories. The former, in effect, are not universals like the categories, nor are they the high et nunc or now here, the diversity to which categories apply in representation. They are complexes of space and time, no doubt transportable but on condition that they impose their own scenery, that they set up camp there where they rest momentarily. They are therefore the objects of an essential encounter rather than of recognition. The best word to designate these is undoubtedly that forged by Samuel Butler, Earhan. They are Earhans. Kant had the liveliest presentiment of such notions participating in a phantasmagoria of the imagination, irreducible both to the universality of the concept and to the particularity of the now-here. For while synthesis is exercised upon the diverse here and now, and the synthetic units or categories are continuous universals which condition all possible experience, the schemata are a priori determinations of space and time which transport real complexes of place and time to all places and times, but in a discontinuous manner. The Kantian schemata would take flight and point beyond themselves in the direction of a conception of differential ideas, if they were not unduly subordinated to the categories which reduce them to the status of simple mediations in the world of representation. Further still, beyond the world of representation, we suppose that a whole problem of being is brought into play by these differences between the categories and the nomadic or fantastical notions, the problem of the manner in which being is distributed among beings. Is it, the last instance, by analogy or univocality? When we consider repetition as an object of representation, we understand it in terms of identity. But we also then explain it in a negative manner. In effect, the identity of a concept does not qualify a repetition unless, at the same time, a negative force, whether of limitation or of opposition, prevents the concept from being further specified or differentiated in relation to the multiplicity that it subsumes. As we saw, matter unites the following two characteristics. It allows a concept which is absolutely identical in as many exemplars as there are times or cases, and it prevents this concept from being further specified by virtue of its natural poverty, or its natural state of unconsciousness or alienation. Matter, therefore, is the identity of spirit, in other words, of the concept, but in the form of an alienated concept, without self-consciousness and outside itself. An essential feature of representation is that it takes a barren material repetition as its model, a repetition understood in terms of the same and explained in terms of the negative. Is this not, however, another antinomy of representation, namely, that it can represent repetition only in this manner, and that it nevertheless cannot represent it in this manner without contradiction? For this barren material model is, properly speaking, unthinkable. How can consciousness, which has only a single presence, represent to itself the unconscious? Identical elements repeat only on condition that there is an independence of cases or a discontinuity of times such that one appears only when the other has disappeared. Within representation, repetition is indeed forced to undo itself even as it occurs. Or rather, it does not occur at all. Repetition in itself cannot occur under these conditions. That is why, in order to represent repetition, contemplative souls must be installed here and there, passive selves, sub-representative syntheses and habituses capable of contracting the cases or the elements into one another, in order that they can subsequently be reconstituted within the space or time of conservation which belongs to representation itself. The consequences of this are very important, since this contraction is a difference or a modification of the contemplative soul, indeed, the modification of this soul. The only modification which truly belongs to it and after which it dies. It appears that the most material repetition occurs only by means of and within a difference which is drawn off by contraction, by means of and within a soul which draws a difference from repetition. Repetition is therefore represented, but on the condition of a soul of a quite different nature, contemplative and contracting, but non-representing and non-represented. Matter is, in effect, populated or covered by such souls, which provide it with a depth without which it would present no bare repetition on the surface. Nor should we believe that the contraction is external to what it contracts, or that this difference is external to the repetition. It is an integral part of it, the constituent part, the depth without which nothing would repeat on the surface. Everything then changes. If a difference is necessarily, in depth, part of the superficial repetition from which it is drawn, the question is, of what does this difference consist? This difference is a contraction. But in what does this contraction consist? Is it not itself the T contracted degree or the most concentrated level of a past which coexists with itself at all levels of relaxation and in all degrees? This was Bergson's splendid hypothesis, the entire past at every moment but at diverse degrees and levels, of which the present is only the most contracted, the most concentrated. The present difference is then no longer, as it was above, a difference drawn from a superficial repetition of moments in such a way as to sketch a depth without which the latter would not exist. Now, it is this depth itself which develops itself for itself. Repetition is no longer a repetition of successive elements or external parts, but of totalities which coexist on different levels or degrees. Difference is no longer drawn from an elementary repetition but is between the levels or degrees of a repetition which is total and totalizing every time. It is displaced and disguised from one level to another, each level including its own singularities or privileged points. What, then, is to be said of the elementary repetition which proceeds by moments, except that it is itself the most relaxed level of this total repetition? And what is to be said of the difference drawn from the elementary repetition, except that it is, on the contrary, the most contracted degree of this total repetition? Difference itself is therefore between two repetitions, between the superficial repetition of the identical and instantaneous external elements that it contracts, and the profound repetition of the internal totalities of an always variable past, of which it is the most contracted level. This is how difference has two faces, or the synthesis of time has two aspects, one, habitus, turned towards the first repetition which it renders possible. The other, mnemosyne, offered up to the second repetition from which it results. It therefore amounts to the same thing to say that material repetition has a secret and passive subject, which does nothing but in which everything takes place, and that there are two repetitions, of which the material is the most superficial. Perhaps it is incorrect to attribute all the characteristics of the other to memory, even if by memory is meant the transcendental faculty of a pure past which invents no less than it remembers. Memory is, nevertheless, the first form in which the opposing characteristics of the two repetitions appear. One of these repetitions is of the same, having no difference but that which is subtracted or drawn off, the other is of the different, and includes difference. One has fixed terms and places, the other essentially includes displacement and disguise. One is negative and by default, the other is positive and by excess. One is of elements, extrinsic parts, cases and times, the other is of variable internal totalities, degrees and levels. One involves succession in fact, the other coexistence in principle. One is static, the other dynamic. One is extensive, the other intensive. One is ordinary, the other distinctive and involving singularities. One is horizontal, the other vertical. One is developed and must be explicated, the other is enveloped and must be interpreted. One is a repetition of equality and symmetry in the effect, the other is a repetition of inequality as though it were a repetition of asymmetry in the cause. One is repetition of mechanism and precision, the other repetition of selection and freedom. One is bare repetition which can be masked only afterwards and in addition, the other is a clothed repetition of which the masks, the displacements and the disguises are the first, last and only elements. We must draw two consequences from these opposing characteristics. First, it is at the same time and from the same point of view that we claim to understand repetition in terms of the same and explain it in negative fashion. Here, there is a confusion in the philosophy of repetition which corresponds exactly to that which compromised the philosophy of difference. In effect, the concept of difference was defined by the moment or the manner in which it was inscribed within the concept in general. The concept of difference was thereby confused with a simply conceptual difference, and difference was thereby understood within identity, since the concept in general was only the manner in which the principle of identity was deployed within representation. Repetition, for its part, could no longer be defined as other than a difference without concept. This definition obviously continued to presuppose the identity of the concept for that which was repeated, but instead of inscribing the difference within the concept, it placed it outside the concept in the form of a numerical difference, and placed the concept itself outside itself, as existing in as many exemplars as there were numerically distinct cases or times. It thereby invoked an external force, a form of exteriority capable of putting difference outside the identical concept, and the identical concept outside itself, by blocking its specification, in the same way as an internal force or form of interiority capable of putting difference into the concept and the concept into itself by means of a continued specification was invoked earlier. It was therefore at the same time and from the same point of view that the supposed identity of the concept integrated an internalized difference in the form of conceptual difference, while, on the contrary, projecting repetition as a correlative difference, but without concept and explained negatively or by default. However, if everything is related in this chain of confusions, so must everything be related in the rectification of difference and repetition. Ideas are not concepts, they are a form of eternally positive differential multiplicity, distinguished from the identity of concepts. Instead of representing difference by subordinating it to the identity of concepts, and thereby to the resemblance of perception, the opposition of predicates and the analogy of judgment, they liberate it and cause it to evolve in positive systems in which different is related to different, making divergence, disparity and decentering so many objects of affirmation which rupture the framework of conceptual representation. The powers of repetition include displacement and disguise, just as difference includes power of divergence and decentering. The one no less than the other belongs to ideas, for ideas no more have an inside than they do an outside, they are eons. The idea makes one and the same problem of difference and repetition. There is an excess and an exaggeration peculiar to ideas which makes difference and repetition the combined object, the simultaneous of the idea. It is from this excess peculiar to ideas that concepts unjustly profit, but in so doing betray and distort the nature of ideas. In effect, concepts repartition this ideal excess into two parts, that of conceptual difference and that of difference without concept, that of the becoming equal or the becoming similar to its own proper identity on the part of the concept, and that of the condition by default which continues to presuppose this same identity, but as though blocked. Nevertheless, if we ask what blocks the concept, we see clearly that it is never some lack, default or opposing thing. It is not a nominal imitation of the concept, nor a natural difference of space and time, nor a spiritual opposition on the part of the unconscious. It is always the excess of the idea which constitutes the superior positivity that arrests the concept or overturns the requirements of representation. Moreover, it is at the same time and from the same point of view that difference ceases to be reduced to a simply conceptual difference, and repetition establishes its most profound link with difference and finds a positive principle both for itself and for this link. Beyond memory, the evident paradox of the death instinct lay in the fact that, despite its name, it seemed to us from the outset to be endowed with a double role, to include all the force of the different in repetition, and at the same time to provide the most positive and most excessive account of repetition. The second consequence is that it is not enough to oppose two repetitions, one bare and material in accordance with the identity and default of the concept, the other clothed, psychical and metaphysical in accordance with the difference and excess of the always positive idea. This second repetition should be seen as the reason of the first. The clothed and living, vertical repetition which includes difference should be regarded as the cause, of which the bare, material and horizontal repetition, from which a difference is merely drawn off, is only an effect. We saw this repeatedly in the three cases of concepts of freedom, concepts of nature and nominal concepts. Every time, the material repetition results from the more profound repetition which unfolds in depth and produces it as an effect, like an external envelope or a detachable shell which loses all meaning and all capacity to reproduce itself once it is no longer animated by the other repetition which is its cause. In this manner, the clothed lies underneath the bare, and produces or excretes it as though it were the effect of its own secretion. The secret repetition surrounds itself with a mechanical and bare repetition as though this were the final barrier which indicates here and there the outer limits of the differences that it communicates within a mobile system. It is always in one and the same movement that repetition includes difference, not as an accidental and extrinsic variant but at its heart, as the essential variant of which it is composed, the displacement and disguise which constitute it as a difference that is itself divergent and displaced, and that it must receive a positive principle which gives rise to material and indifferent repetition, the abandoned snake skin, the envelope emptied of what it implicates, the epidermis which lives and dies only from its own soul or latent content. This is the case with concepts of nature. Nature would never repeat, its repetitions would always be hypothetical, dependent upon the goodwill of the experimenter and the savant, if it were reducible to the superficiality of matter, if that matter itself did not involve a depth or side of nature in which living and mortal repetition unfolds and becomes positive and imperative, on condition that it displaces and disguises an ever-present difference which makes repetition an evolution as such. One savant does not make a spring, nor a series of savants the return of the seasons. The same would never leave itself to be distributed across several equivalents in cyclical alternation if difference were not displacing itself in these cycles and disguising itself in this same, rendering repetition imperative but offering only the bare to the eyes of the external observer who believes that the variants are not the essential and have little effect upon that which they nevertheless constitute from within. This is even more true of concepts of freedom and nominal concepts. The words and actions of men give rise to bare, material repetitions, but as effects of more profound repetitions of a different kind, effects in a causal, optical and vestiary sense. Repetition is pathos and the philosophy of repetition is pathology. However, there are so many pathologies, so many repetitions entwined in one another. When an obsessive repeats a ceremony once, twice, or when he repeats an enumeration, 1, 2, 3, he carries out a repetition of elements in extension which both translate and ward off another, vertical and intensive repetition, that of a past which is displaced each time or with each number, and is disguised in the overall set of numbers and times. It is the equivalent of a cosmological proof in pathology. The horizontal linkage of causes and effects in the world requires a totalizing, extra-worldly first cause as the vertical cause of the causes and effects. We repeat twice simultaneously, but not the same repetition, once mechanically and materially in breadth, and once symbolically and by means of simulacra in depth. First we repeat the parts, then we repeat the whole on which the parts depend. These two repetitions do not take place in the same dimension, they coexist. One is a repetition of instants, the other of the past, one is a repetition of elements, the other is totalizing, and the most profound and productive is obviously not the most visible or the one which produces the most effect. In general, the two repetitions enter into so many different relations that it would require an extremely systematic clinical study, of a kind yet to be undertaken, in order to distinguish the cases which correspond to their possible combinations. Consider the gestural or linguistic repetitions and iterations or stereotypical behaviors associated with dementia and schizophrenia. These no longer seem to manifest a will capable of investing an object within the context of a ceremony. Rather, they function like reflexes which indicate a general breakdown of investment, whence the impossibility for patients to repeat at will in the tests to which they are subjected. It is nevertheless the case that involuntary repetition depends not upon aphasic or amnesiac difficulties, as a negative explanation would suggest, but on subcortical lesions and thymic disorders. Is this another way of explaining repetition negatively, as though the patient reverted through degeneration to primitive, non-integrated circuits? In fact, in cases of iterations and even of stereotypes, we should note the constant presence of contractions, which show up at least in parasitic vowels or consonants. Contraction continues to have two aspects, one by which it bears upon a physical element of repetition which it modifies, the other by which it concerns a psychic totality which is repeatable in different degrees. In this sense, we can recognize a persistent intentionality in every stereotype, even in a schizophrenic grinding of the jaws. This intentionality amounts to investing the entire psychic life in a fragment, gesture or word, in the absence of any other object of investment. these in turn becoming the elements of the other repetition. For example, the patient who turns ever more rapidly on one foot, the other leg extended in such a way as to repel any person approaching from behind, thereby miming his horror of women and his fear of being surprised by them. 8. The properly pathological aspect lies in the fact that, on the one hand, the contraction no longer ensures a resonance between two or more levels, simultaneously playable in differentiated manners, but rather crushes them all and compresses them into the stereotypical fragment. On the other hand, contraction no longer draws from the element a difference or modification which would permit repetition within a space and time organized by the will. On the contrary, it makes the modification itself the element to be repeated, taking itself as object in an acceleration which precisely renders impossible any bare repetition of elements. Thus, in these cases of iteration and stereotype we see not an independence of purely mechanical repetition, but rather a specific difficulty in the relation between the two repetitions, and in the process by which one is and remains the cause of the other. Repetition is the power of language, and far from being explicable in negative fashion by some default on the part of nominal concepts, it implies an always excessive idea of poetry. The coexistent levels of a psychic totality may be considered to be actualized in differentiated series, according to the singularities which characterize them. These series are liable to resonate under the influence of a fragment or dark precursor which stands for this totality in which all the levels coexist. Each series is therefore repeated in the other, at the same time as the precursor is displaced from one level to another and disguised in all the series. It therefore does not belong to any level or degree. In the case of verbal series, we call a word which designates the sense of a preceding word a word of higher degree. However, the linguistic precursor, the esoteric or poetic word par excellence, object equals X, transcends all degrees to the extent that it purports to say both itself and its sense, while appearing as always displaced and disguised nonsense, the secret word which has no sense, snark or bleachery. All the verbal series themselves therefore form so many synonyms in relation to this word, while it plays the role of a homonym for all the series. It is therefore by virtue of its entirely positive and ideal power that language organizes its entire system in the form of a clothed repetition. Of course, it goes without saying that real poems are not supposed to be adequate to this idea of poetry. In order for a real poem to emerge, we must identify the dark precursor and confer upon it at least a nominal identity. In short, we must provide the resonance with a body. Then, as in a song, the differentiated series are organized into couplets or verses, while the precursor is incarnated in an antiphon or chorus. The couplets turn around the chorus. What combines nominal concepts and concepts of freedom better than a song? A bare repetition is produced under these conditions, at once in the return of the chorus which represents the object equals X, and in certain aspects of the differentiated couplets which represent in turn the interpenetration of the series, measure, rhyme, or even verses rhyming with the chorus. In some cases almost bare repetitions take the place of synonymy and homonymy, as they do with Peggy and Raymond Roussel. Here, the genius of poetry identifies itself with these brute repetitions. Nevertheless, this genius belongs in the first place to the idea, and to the manner in which it produces brute repetitions on the basis of a more secret repetition. The distinction between the two repetitions, however, is still not enough. The second repetition still participates in all the ambiguities of memory and ground. It includes difference, but includes it only between the degrees or levels. As we saw, it appears first in the form of the circles of the past coexistent in themselves, then in the form of a circle of coexistence of the past and the present, and finally in the form of a circle of all the presents which pass and which coexist in relation to the object equals X. In short, metaphysics makes a circle of the physical or physis. How, then, are we to avoid this profound repetition being hidden by the bare repetitions that it inspires, and succumbing to the illusion of a primacy of brute repetition? In the same movement, the ground falls back into the representation of what it grounds, while the circles begin to turn in the manner of the same. For this reason, it always seemed to us that the circles were unravelled in a third synthesis, where the ground was abolished in a groundlessness, the ideas were separated from the forms of memory, and the displacement and disguise of repetition engaged divergence and decentering, the powers of difference. Beyond the cycles, the at first straight line of the empty form of time, beyond memory, the death instinct, beyond resonance, forced movement. Beyond bare repetition and clothed repetition, beyond that from which difference is drawn and that which includes it, a repetition which makes the difference. Beyond the grounded and grounding repetitions, a repetition of ungrounding on which depend both that which enchains and that which liberates, that which dies and that which lives within repetition. Beyond physical repetition and psychic or metaphysical repetition, an ontological repetition? The role of the latter would not be to suppress the other two but, on the one hand, to distribute difference to them, in the form of difference drawn off or included, and, on the other hand, to produce the illusion by which they are affected while nevertheless preventing them from developing the related error into which they fall. In a certain sense, the ultimate repetition, the ultimate theatre, therefore encompasses everything, while in another sense it destroys everything, and in yet another sense selects among everything. Perhaps the highest object of art is to bring into play simultaneously all these repetitions, with their differences in kind and rhythm, their respective displacements and disguises, their divergences and decenterings, to embed them in one another and to envelop one or the other in illusions the effect of which varies in each case. Art does not imitate, above all because it repeats all the repetitions. By virtue of an internal power, an imitation is a copy, but art is simulation, it reverses copies into simulacra. Even the most mechanical, the most banal, the most habitual and the most stereotyped repetition finds a place in works of art, it is always displaced in relation to other repetitions, and it is subject to the condition that a difference may be extracted from it for these other repetitions. For there is no other aesthetic problem than that of the insertion of art into everyday life. The more our daily life appears standardized, stereotyped and subject to an accelerated reproduction of objects of consumption, the more art must be injected into it in order to extract from it that little difference which plays simultaneously between other levels of repetition, and even in order to make the two extremes resonate, namely, the habitual series of consumption and the instinctual series of destruction and death. Art thereby connects the tableau of cruelty with that of stupidity, and discovers underneath consumption a schizophrenic clattering of the jaws, and underneath the most ignoble destructions of war, still more processes of consumption. It aesthetically reproduces the illusions and mystifications which make up the real essence of this civilization, in order that difference may at last be expressed with a force of anger which is itself repetitive and capable of introducing the strangest selection, even if this is only a contraction here and there, in other words, a freedom for the end of a world. Each art has its interrelated techniques or repetitions, the critical and revolutionary power of which may attain the highest degree and lead us from the sad repetitions of habit to the profound repetitions of memory, and then to the ultimate repetitions of death in which our freedom is played out. We simply wish to offer three examples, however diverse and disparate these may be. First, the manner in which all the repetitions coexist in modern music, such as the development of the leitmotif in Berg's. Second, the manner in which, within painting, pop art pushed the copy of the copy, etc., to that extreme point at which it reverses and becomes a simulacrum, such as Warhol's remarkable serial series, in which all the repetitions of habit, memory and death are conjugated, and finally the novelistic manner in which little modifications are torn from the brute and mechanical repetitions of habit, which in turn nourish repetitions of memory and ultimately lead to repetitions in which life and death are in play, and risk reacting upon the whole and introducing into it a new selection, all these repetitions coexisting and yet being displaced in relation to one another, as La Modification, or indeed last year at Marienbad, which shows the particular techniques of repetition which cinema can deploy or invent. Are not all the repetitions ordered in the pure form of time? In effect, this pure form or straight line is defined by an order which distributes a before, a during and an after, by a totality which incorporates all three in the simultaneity of its a priori synthesis, and by a series which makes a type of repetition correspond to each. From this point of view, we must essentially distinguish between the pure form and the empirical contents. The empirical contents are mobile and succeed one another, while the a priori determinations of time, on the contrary, are fixed or held, as though in a photo or a freeze frame, coexisting within the static synthesis which distinguishes a redoubtable action in relation to the image. This action may be anything from an empirical point of view, or at least its occasion may be found in any empirical circumstances. Action equals X. All that is required is that the circumstances allow its isolation and that it is sufficiently embedded in the moment such that its image extends over time as a whole and becomes, as it were, the a priori symbol of the form. On the other hand, with regard to the empirical contents of time, we distinguish the first, second, third. In their indefinite succession, it may be that this succession can be defined as a cycle, and that repetition is therefore impossible, either in an intracyclic form in which 2 repeats 1, 3 repeats 2 and so on, or in an intercyclic form in which 1 repeats 1, 2 repeats 2, 3 repeats 3. Even if an indefinite succession of cycles is supposed, the first time will be defined as the same or the undifferentiated, either at the origin of all cycles or in between two cycles. In any case, the repetition remains external to something which is repeated and must be supposed primary. A frontier is established between a first time and repetition itself. The question whether the first time escapes repetition, in which case it is referred to as once and for all, or, on the contrary, is repeated within a cycle or from one cycle to another, depends entirely upon the reflection of an observer. The first time being regarded as the same, the question is asked whether the second displays sufficient resemblance with the first to be identified as the same again, a question which can be answered only by the establishment of relations of analogy within judgment, taking into account the variations in empirical circumstances. Is Luther the analogue of Paul, the French Revolution the analogue of the Roman Republic? Things are very different, however, from the point of view of the pure form or straight line of time. Now, each determination, the first, second and third, the before, during and after, is already repetition in itself, in the pure form of time and in relation to the image of the action. The before or the first time is no less repetition than the second or the third time. Each time being in itself repetition, the problem is no longer susceptible to the analogies of reflection on the part of a supposed observer. Rather, it must be lived as a problem of the internal conditions of the action in relation to the redoubtable image. Repetition no longer bears, hypothetically, upon a first time which escapes it, and in any case remains external to it. Repetition bears upon repetitions, upon modes and types of repetition, in an imperative manner. The frontier or difference is therefore singularly displaced. It is no longer between the first time and the others, between the repeated and the repetition, but between these types of repetition. It is repetition itself that is repeated. Furthermore, once and for all no longer qualifies a first time which would escape repetition, but on the contrary a type of repetition which opposes another type operating an infinity of times. In this manner Christian repetition is opposed to atheist repetition, and Kierkegaardian to Nietzschean, for in the case of Kierkegaard it is repetition itself which takes place once and for all, whereas according to Nietzsche it operates for all times. Nor is this simply a numerical difference, it is, rather, a fundamental difference between these two kinds of repetition. How are we to explain the fact that once repetition bears upon repetitions, once it assembles them all and introduces difference between them, it thereby acquires a formidable power of selection? Everything depends on the distribution of repetitions in the form, the order, the totality and the series of time. This distribution is extremely complex. At a first level, the repetition of the before is defined by default or in a negative manner. One repeats because one does not know, because one does not remember, etc., or because one is not capable of performing the action, whether this action remains to be performed or is already performed. One therefore signifies here the unconscious of the id as the first power of repetition. The repetition of the during is defined by a becoming similar or a becoming equal. One becomes capable of performing the action, one becomes equal to the image of the action, the one now signifying the unconscious of the ego, its metamorphosis, its projection in an I or ego ideal in the form of the second power of repetition. However, since to become similar or equal is always to become similar or equal to something that is supposed to be identical in itself, or supposed to enjoy the privilege of an originary identity, it appears that the image of the action to which one becomes similar or equal stands here only for the identity of the concept in general, or that of the I. At this level, the first two repetitions gather together and distribute amongst themselves the characteristics of the negative and the identical, which, as we have seen, constitute the limits of representation. At another level, the hero repeats the first, that of the before, as though in a dream and in a bare, mechanical and stereotypical manner which constitutes the comic, yet this repetition would be nothing if it did not refer to something hidden or disguised in its own series, capable of introducing contractions therein as though it were a hesitant habitus in which the other repetition ripened. This second repetition of the during is one in which the hero himself embraces disguise and assumes the metamorphosis which replaces him on a tragic plane, with his own identity, the inner depths of his memory and that of the whole world, in order that, having become capable of action, he purports to be equal to the whole of time. At this second level, the two repetitions rework and redistribute in their own way the two syntheses of time, and the two forms, bare and clothed, which characterize them. Certainly, we could imagine that the two repetitions enter into a cycle of which they form two analogous parts, and also that they begin again at the end of a cycle, embarking upon a new path itself analogous to the first, and finally, that these two intracyclic and extracyclic hypotheses are not mutually exclusive but reinforce one another and repeat the repetitions on different levels. In all this, however, everything depends upon the nature of the third time. Analogy requires that a third time be given, just as the circle of the Phaedo requires that its two arcs be completed by a third on which everything is decided with regard to their own return. For example, we distinguished between the Old Testament with its repetition by default and the New Testament with its repetition by metamorphosis, Joachim of Flora, or indeed, in another manner, we distinguished between the age of the gods, by default in the human unconscious, and the age of heroes by metamorphosis in the human self, Vico. The answer to the double question, 1. Do the two times repeat one another in an analogical manner within the same cycle? 2. Are these two times themselves repeated in a new analogous cycle, depends solely and above all upon the nature of the third time, Flora's testament to come, Vico's the age of men, Balanche's man without name. For if this third time, the future, is the proper place of decision, it is entirely likely that, by virtue of its nature, it eliminates the two intracyclic and extracyclic hypotheses, that it undoes them both and puts time into a straight line, straightening it out and extracting the pure form. In other words, it takes time out of joint and, being itself the third repetition, renders the repetition of the other two impossible. Far from ensuring the occurrence of the cycle and analogy, the third time excludes them. In accordance with the new frontier, the difference between the two repetitions becomes the following: the before and the during are and remain repetitions, but operate only once and for all. The third repetition distributes them in accordance with the straight line of time, but also eliminates them, determining them to operate only once and for all, keeping the all times for the third time alone. In this sense, Joachim of Flora saw the essential: there are two significations for a single signifier. The essential is the third testament. There are two repetitions for a single repeated, but only the signified or the repeated repeats itself, abolishing its significations along with its conditions. The frontier is no longer between a first time and a repetition that it renders hypothetically possible, but between the conditional repetitions and the third repetition or repetition within the eternal return which renders impossible the return of the other two. Only the third testament turns on itself. There is eternal return only in the third time. It is here that the freeze frame begins to move once more, or that the straight line of time, as though drawn by its own length, reforms a strange loop which in no way resembles the earlier cycle, but leads into the formless, and operates only for the third time and for that which belongs to it. As we have seen, the condition of the action by default does not return, the condition of the agent by metamorphosis does not return. All that returns, the eternal return, is the unconditioned in the product. The expulsive and selective force of the eternal return, its centrifugal force, consists of distributing repetition among the three times of the pseudo-cycle, but also of ensuring that the first two repetitions do not return, that they occur only once and for all, and that only the third repetition which turns upon itself returns for all times, for eternity. The negative, the similar and the analogous are repetitions, but they do not return, forever driven away by the wheel of eternal return. We know that Nietzsche gave no exposition of the eternal return, for reasons which pertain both to the simplest objective criticism of the texts and to their most modest dramatic or poetic comprehension. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the question of the eternal return arises twice, but each time it appears as a truth not yet reached and not expressed, once when the dwarf speaks, ill, of the vision and the riddle, and a second time when the animals speak, ill, the convalescent. The first time is enough to make Zarathustra ill, producing his terrible nightmare and leading him to undertake a sea voyage. The second time, after a further crisis, the convalescent Zarathustra smiles indulgently at his animals, knowing that his destiny will be decided only in an unsaid third time, that announced at the end, the sign has come. We cannot make use of the posthumous notes, except in directions confirmed by Nietzsche's published works, since these notes are reserved material, as it were, put aside for future elaboration. We know only that Thus Spoke Zarathustra is unfinished, and that it was supposed to have a further section concerning the death of Zarathustra, as though a third time and a third occasion. Nevertheless, the existing dramatic progression of Thus Spoke Zarathustra allows a series of questions and answers. 1. Why, on the first occasion, does Zarathustra become angry and suffer such a terrible nightmare when the dwarf says, "All truth is crooked, time itself is a circle"? As he explains later in interpreting his nightmare, he fears that eternal return means the return of everything, of the same and the similar, including the dwarf and including the smallest of men, c. the convalescent. He particularly fears that repetition will only be negative and will occur only by default, that one repeats only because one is deaf, lame and a dwarf, perched on the shoulders of others, or because one is incapable of an act, the death of God, even though the act has already occurred. He knows that a circular repetition would necessarily be of this type. That is why Zarathustra denies that time is a circle, and replies to the dwarf, "Spirit of gravity, do not simplify matters too much." By contrast, he holds that time is a straight line in two opposing directions. If a strangely decentered circle should form, this will be only at the end of the straight line. 2. Why does Zarathustra undergo a further crisis and become convalescent? Zarathustra is like Hamlet, the sea voyage has made him capable. He has reached the becoming similar or the becoming equal of the heroic metamorphosis, yet he feels that the hour has not yet come, c. of involuntary bliss. He has already banished the shadow of the negative, he knows that repetition is not that of the dwarf. Nevertheless, the becoming equal or becoming capable of the metamorphosis has only brought him to a supposed originary identity, he has not yet banished the apparent positivity of the identical. That requires the new crisis and convalescence. The animals can then say that it is the same and the similar that return, they can expound the eternal return in the form of a positive natural certitude. Zarathustra, feigning sleep, no longer listens to them, for he knows that the eternal return is something different again, and that it does not cause the same and the similar to return. 3. Why does Zarathustra still say nothing, why is he not yet ripe, and why will he become so only in a third unsaid time? The revelation that not everything returns, nor does the same, implies as much distress as the belief in the return of the same and of everything, even though it is a different distress. The highest test is to understand the eternal return as a selective thought, and repetition in the eternal return as selective being. Time must be understood and lived as out of joint, and seen as a straight line which mercilessly eliminates those who embark upon it, who come upon the scene but repeat only once and for all. The selection occurs between two repetitions. Those who repeat negatively and those who repeat identically will be eliminated. They repeat only once. The eternal return is only for the third time, the time of the drama, after the comic and after the tragic. The drama is defined when the tragic becomes joyful and the comic becomes the comedy of the overman. The eternal return is only for the third repetition, only in the third repetition. The circle is at the end of the line. Neither the dwarf nor the hero, neither Zarathustral nor Zarathustra convalescent, will return. Not only does the eternal return not make everything return, it causes those who fail the test to perish. Nietzsche carefully indicates the two distinct types who do not survive the test, the passive small man or last man, and the great heroic active man, the one who has become a man who wants to perish. The negative does not return. The identical does not return. The same and the similar, the analogous and the opposed, do not return. Only affirmation returns, in other words, the different, the dissimilar. Nothing which denies the eternal return returns, neither the default nor the equal, only the excessive returns. How much distress before one extracts joy from such a selective affirmation? Only the third repetition returns. At the cost of the resemblance and identity of Zarathustra himself, Zarathustra must lose these, the resemblance of the self and the identity of the I must perish, and Zarathustra must die. Zarathustra hero became equal, but what he became equal to was the unequal, at the cost of losing the sham identity of the hero. For one repeats eternally, but one now refers to the world of impersonal individualities and pre-individual singularities. The eternal return is not the effect of the identical upon a world become similar, it is not an external order imposed upon the chaos of the world. On the contrary, the eternal return is the internal identity of the world and of chaos, the cosmos. How could the reader believe that Nietzsche, who was the greatest critic of these categories, implicated everything, the same, the identical, the similar, the equal, the I and the self in the eternal return? How could it be believed that he understood the eternal return as a cycle, when he opposed his hypothesis to every cyclical hypothesis? How could it be believed that he lapsed into the false and insipid idea of an opposition between a circular time and a linear time, an ancient and a modern time? What, however, is the content of this third time, this formlessness at the end of the form of time, this decentered circle which displaces itself at the end of the straight line? What is this content which is affected or modified by the eternal return? We have tried to show that it is a question of simulacra, and simulacra alone. The power of simulacra is such that they essentially implicate at once the object equals X in the unconscious. The word equals X in language, and the action equals X in history. Simulacra are those systems in which different relates to different by means of difference itself. What is essential is that we find in these systems no prior identity, no internal resemblance. It is all a matter of difference in the series, and of differences of difference in the communication between series. What is displaced and disguised in the series cannot and must not be identified, but exists and acts as the differentiator of difference. Moreover, repetition necessarily flows from this play of difference in two ways. On the one hand, because each series is explicated and unfolded only in implicating the others, it therefore repeats the others and is repeated in the others, which in turn implicate it. However, it is implicated by the others only insofar as it simultaneously implicates those others, with the result that it returns to itself as many times as it returns to another. Returning to itself is the ground of the bare repetitions, just as returning to another is the ground of the clothed repetitions. On the other hand, the play which presides over the distribution of simulacra ensures the repetition of each numerically distinct combination, since the different throws are not, for their own part, numerically but only formally distinct. As a result, all the outcomes are included in the number of each according to the relations between implicated and implicator just referred to, each returning in the others in accordance with the formal distinction of throws, but also always returning to itself in accordance with the unity of the play of difference. Repetition in the eternal return appears under all these aspects as the peculiar power of difference, and the displacement and disguise of that which repeats only reproduce the divergence and the decentering of the different in a single movement of diaphora or transport. The eternal return affirms difference, it affirms dissemblance and disparateness, chance, multiplicity and becoming. Zarathustra is the dark precursor of eternal return. The eternal return eliminates precisely all those instances which strangle difference and prevent its transport by subjecting it to the quadruple yoke of representation. Difference is recovered, liberated, only at the limit of its power, in other words, by repetition in the eternal return. The eternal return eliminates that which renders it impossible by rendering impossible the transport of difference. It eliminates the presuppositions of representation, namely the same and the similar, the analog and the negative. For representation and its presuppositions return, but only once, they return no more than one time, once and for all, thereafter eliminated for all times. Nevertheless, we speak of the unity of the play of difference, we speak of the same series when it returns to itself, and of similar series when one returns to another. However, very small linguistic shifts express upheavals and reversals in the concept. We saw that the two formulae similars differ and difference resemble one another, belong to entirely foreign worlds. It is the same here, the eternal return is indeed the similar, repetition in the eternal return is indeed the identical, but precisely the resemblance and the identity do not pre-exist the return of that which returns. They do not in the first instance qualify what returns, they are indistinguishable from its return. It is not the same which returns, it is not the similar which returns, rather, the same is the returning of that which returns, in other words, of the different, the similar is the returning of that which returns, in other words, of the dissimilar. The repetition in the eternal return is the same, but the same insofar as it is said uniquely of difference and the different. This is a complete reversal of the world of representation, and of the sense that identical and similar had in that world. This reversal is not merely speculative but eminently practical, since it defines the conditions of legitimate use of the words identical and similar by linking them exclusively to simulacra, while denouncing the ordinary usage made from the point of view of representation. For this reason, the philosophy of difference seems to us badly established as long as it is content with the terminological opposition between the platitude of the identical as equal to itself and the profundity of the same which is supposed to incorporate the different. For while the same which includes difference and the identical which excludes it may be opposed in many ways, they remain no less principles of representation. At most, they inspire the dispute between infinite representation and finite representation. The true distinction is not between the identical and the same, but between the identical, the same or the similar. It matters little which, once these are posited as primary on various grounds, and the identical, the same or the similar understood as secondary powers, but all the more powerful as such, turning around difference, being said of difference itself. At this point, everything effectively changes. The same, forever decentered, effectively turns around difference only once difference, having assumed the whole of being, applies only to simulacra which have assumed the whole of being. The history of the long era is the history of representation, the history of the icons. For the same, or the identical, has an ontological sense, the repetition in the eternal return of that which differs, the repetition of each implicating series. The similar has an ontological sense, the eternal return of that which makes dissimilar, the repetition of implicated series. However, the eternal return itself, in turning, gives rise to a certain illusion in which it delights and admires itself, and which it employs in order to double its affirmation of that which differs. It produces an image of identity as though this were the end of the different. It produces an image of resemblance as the external effect of the disparate. It produces an image of the negative as the consequence of what it affirms, the consequence of its own affirmation. It surrounds the simulacra and surrounds itself with this identity, this resemblance and this negative. However, these are precisely a simulated identity, resemblance and negative. It plays upon these as though upon a never-attained end, an always distorted effect and an always perverted consequence. They are the products of the functioning of simulacra. It employs them each time in order to decenter the identical, distort the similar and pervert the consequence. For it is true that there are only perverted consequences, only distorted similarities, only decentered identities and only unattained ends. Reveling in what it produces, the eternal return denounces every other use of ends, identities, resemblances and negations, even, and especially negation, which it employs in the service of simulacra in the most radical manner, namely, to deny everything which denies multiple and different affirmation, in order to double what it affirms. It is essential to the function of simulacra to simulate the identical, the similar and the negative. There is a necessary linkage between the ontological sense and the simulated sense. The second derive, from the first, in other words, it remains adrift, a la derive, without autonomy or spontaneity, a simple effect of the ontological cause which plays upon it like a tempest. How could representation not profit from this? How could representation not be born once, in the trough of a wave, to the advantage of the illusion? How could it not make of the illusion an error? By this means, the identity of the simulacra, simulated identity, finds itself projected or retrojected onto the internal difference. The simulated external resemblance finds itself interiorized in the system. The negative becomes principle and agent. Each product of the functioning assumes an autonomy. It is then supposed that difference is valid, exists and is thinkable only within a pre-existing same which understands it as conceptual difference and determines it by means of opposition between predicates. It is supposed that repetition is valid, exists and is thinkable only under an identical which in turn posits it as a difference without concept and explains it negatively. Instead of understanding bare repetition as the product of clothed repetition, and the latter as the power of difference, difference itself is made into a byproduct of the same in the concept, clothed repetition into a derivative of bare repetition, and bare repetition a byproduct of the identical outside the concept. It is in the same milieu, that of representation, that difference is posited on the one hand as conceptual difference, and repetition on the other hand as difference without a concept. Moreover, since there is no longer any conceptual difference between the ultimate determinable concepts among which the same is distributed, the world of representation finds itself in the grip of a network of analogies which makes difference and repetition simple concepts of reflection. The same and the identical may be interpreted in many ways, in the sense of a perseveration, there is A, in the sense of an equality, A equals A, or a resemblance, A-B, in the sense of an opposition, A equals non-A, or in the sense of an analogy, as is suggested by the excluded third term, which determines the conditions under which the third term is determinable only in a relation identical to the relation between two others, A equals non-A, B equals C/a non-CD. But all these ways belong to representation, to which analogy brings a final touch, a specific closure or the last element. They are the development of the erroneous sense which betrays both the nature of difference and that of repetition. The long error begins here, all the longer since it occurs only once. We have seen how analogy essentially belonged to the world of representation. Once the limits of the inscription of difference in the concept in general are fixed, the upper limit is represented by the ultimate determinable concepts, the genera of being or categories, while the lower limit is represented by the smallest determined concepts, species. In the case of finite representation, generic and specific difference have different procedures and differ in kind, but they are strictly complementary. The equivocity of the one has its correlate in the univocity of the other. In effect, the genus in relation to its species is univocal, while being in relation to the genera or categories themselves is equivocal. The analogy of being implies both these two aspects at once, one by which being is distributed in determinable forms which necessarily distinguish and vary the sense, the other by which being so distributed is necessarily repartitioned among well-determined beings, each endowed with a unique sense. What is missed at the two extremities is the collective sense of being, etra, and the play of individuating difference in being, et ant. Everything takes place between generic difference and specific difference. The genuine universal is missed no less than the true singular. The only common sense of being is distributive, and the only individual difference is general. The list of categories may well be opened up or representation may be made infinite, nevertheless, being continues to be said in several senses according to the categories, and that of which it is said is determined only by differences in general. The world of representation presupposes a certain type of sedentary distribution, which divides or shares out that which is distributed in order to give each their fixed share, as in the bad game or the bad way to play. The pre-existing rules define distributive hypotheses according to which the results of the throws are repartitioned. Representation essentially implies an analogy of being. However, the only realized ontology, in other words, the university of being, is repetition. From Duns Scotus to Spinoza, the univocal position has always rested upon two fundamental theses. According to one, there are indeed forms of being, but contrary to what is suggested by the categories, these forms involve no division within being or plurality of ontological senses. According to the other, that of which being is said is repartitioned according to essentially mobile individuating differences which necessarily endow each one with a plurality of modal significations. This program is expounded and demonstrated with genius from the beginning of the Ethics. We are told that the attributes are irreducible to genera or categories because while they are formally distinct they all remain equal and ontologically one, and introduce no division into the substance which is said or expressed through them in a single and same sense. In other words, the real distinction between attributes is a formal, not a numerical distinction. We are told, on the other hand, that the modes are irreducible to species because they are repartitioned within attributes according to individuating differences which are degrees of power operating in intensity, and immediately relate them to univocal being. In other words, the numerical distinction between beings is a modal, not a real distinction. Is it not the same with the true throw of the dice? The throws are formally distinct, but with regard to an ontologically unique throw, while the outcomes implicate, displace and recover their combinations in one another throughout the unique and open space of the univocal. All that Spinozism needed to do for the univocal to become an object of pure affirmation was to make substance turn around the modes, in other words, to realize university in the form of repetition in the eternal return. For while it is true that analogy has two aspects, one according to which being is said in several senses, and the other according to which it is said of something fixed and well determined, university, for its part, has two completely opposing aspects according to which being is said in all manners in a single same sense, but is said thereby of that which differs, is said of a difference which is itself always mobile and displaced within being. The university of being and individuating difference are connected outside representation as profoundly as generic difference and specific difference are connected within representation from the point of view of analogy. University signifies that being itself is univocal, while that of which it is said is equivocal, precisely the opposite of analogy. Being is said according to forms which do not break the unity of its sense, it is said in a single same sense throughout all its forms. That is why we oppose to categories notions of a different kind. That of which it is said, however, differs, it is said of difference itself. It is not analogous being which is distributed among the categories and allocates a fixed part to beings, but the beings which are distributed across the space of univocal being, opened by all the forms. Opening is an essential feature of university. The nomadic distributions or crowned anarchies in the univocal stand opposed to the sedentary distributions of analogy. Only does the cry resound, everything is equal. And everything returns. However, this everything is equal and this everything returns can be said only at the point at which the extremity of difference is reached. A single and same voice for the whole thousand-voiced multiple, a single and same ocean for all the drops, a single clamor of being for all beings, on condition that each being, each drop and each voice has reached the state of excess, in other words, the difference which displaces and disguises them and, in turning upon its mobile cusp, causes them to return.